Garnet Falls, Wyoming Territory. Winter, 1888. The snow was swallowing everything whole when Ephraim Thorne found her collapsed on a hunter's cabin bunk, foot crushed and blackening, fever burning her alive from the inside out. "You still with me?" F dropped to one knee, his scarred hand pressing carefully against her forehead. Those dark eyes snapped open, sharper than he expected, fiercer than any dying woman had a right to be. "You're late, Mr. Thorne. Watch to find out what this woman did that left an entire town speechless and brought the most powerful man in the valley to his knees." The ribbon was red silk, crimson, actually, the color of something that still had life in it. Ephraim Thorne turned it over in his hands, slow and careful, the way a man handles something he has no business touching, but can't quite bring himself to set down. His fingers were rough work, scarred across the knuckles, split at two of the joints from the cold, stained, permanent brown, at the tips from saddle leather and pine resin. He was aware of all that roughness as he smoothed the ribbon flat across his palm. He'd kept it from her second letter. Hetty Vance had tied it around the folded paper like a small, deliberate gift, and the gesture had puzzled him for weeks, because nothing else she wrote was sentimental in the least. The train depot at Garnet Falls, Wyoming Territory, was about as cheerful as a funeral in January, which it resembled given that the last eastbound coach had just pulled out 10 minutes ago, trailing a long black plume of smoke that the wind shredded apart almost immediately. The platform was empty now, just the depot agent who'd already retreated inside, and the snow. The snow had started an hour ago. It wasn't supposed to start until Thursday. He stood there a moment longer, watching the place where the train had been. The tracks stretched east and disappeared into a wall of gray. Beyond that gray was the rest of the country. Cities, streets, gas lamps, indoor plumbing. Philadelphia. Hester Vance was not on that platform. Hester Vance was not anywhere he could see. He folded the ribbon back into his coat pocket, turned up his collar, and walked to where he'd hitched his horse. There were 4 men standing outside Garner's general store when F rode past, and he could feel their attention on him the way you feel a bruise someone presses on. They weren't subtle about it. One of them laughed, low and mean. Another said something that got lost in the wind, but arrived at F's ears in pieces. "City woman and knew it, and fool." F kept riding. It wasn't that the words didn't land. They did. But a man learns, after enough years, which fights are worth stopping his horse for, and which ones aren't. These 4 weren't worth it. They were just cold men, with small lives who found warmth in other people's disappointments. Still, he heard them. He'd heard variations of the same thing for 3 months, ever since word got out that Ephraim, Thorne the widower up at the Broken Spear, the one who hadn't said 10 words to anyone since Clara died, had placed an advertisement for a mail-order bride. The town had opinions about that. They always did. Soft city woman. Never last a winter. What's a schoolteacher going to do on a horse ranch, F? Read poetry to the mares? He'd let them talk. There wasn't any point in explaining Hetty Vance to people who'd already made up their minds about her, because explaining her would have required him to read her letters aloud. And those letters were not for public consumption. They were for him. They were possibly the most private things he'd ever been given. Cass Hayes was at the Broken Spear when F got back. He was sitting on an overturned crate near the barn door, working on a bridle with his good right hand, his crippled left arm braced against his knee to hold the leather steady. He looked up when F rode in, and he read the answer in F's face, before F had even dismounted. "She wasn't on it," Cass said. Not a question. No. Could have missed a connection somewhere. Could be any number of things. Cass set the bridle down. Weather's been unpredictable all week. Maybe the Chicago line ran late and she missed the transfer at. Could be, F said. He unsaddled the gelding in silence, worked the brush over him with long, even strokes. The horse leaned into it. Animals always knew when their people were troubled, and they either fled or leaned in. F had always respected that about horses. They didn't pretend. When he came inside, he built the fire up and sat at the table and pulled out Hetty's letters. All 9 of them. He kept them in a tin that had once held tobacco, and he'd read each one enough times that the folds were soft, and the ink at the creases had started to feather. He wasn't reading them to console himself. He was reading them because he was trying to solve a problem. And the problem was this. Hester Vance was not a woman who broke her word. He was certain of that. He'd been certain of it since her third letter, and he'd gotten more certain with each one after. The first letter most men wrote in response to the agency's correspondence was formal, guarded, a list of the man's qualities and holdings and general worthiness. F had written his the same way, figuring that was the expected form. Her first letter back had been polite. Careful, the kind of letter a sensible woman writes. To a stranger she isn't sure about yet, but her second letter. That one had shifted. He'd asked her a straightforward question about her work. He'd been curious, genuinely, about bookbinding. He knew nothing about it. She'd answered him for 3 full pages, describing the structure of a hand-sewn signature, the difference between vellum and buckram, the particular satisfaction of pressing a finished spine flat and feeling it hold. She wrote about it, the way he thought about horses, with that specific reverence for a craft understood deep down in the hands. Then she'd turned around and asked him about his horses with the same directness. And she'd asked good questions, the kind that proved she'd been paying attention to what he'd told her. By the fourth letter, they were arguing, politely, but genuinely, about Frederick Douglass, and about the Homestead Act, and about whether a woman of independent means had any obligation to marry at all. She'd told him flat out that she had no intention of trading one form of servitude for another. And if he was looking for a cook and a laundress, he should say so now and save them both the postage. He'd written back that he was looking for a partner, not a domestic arrangement, and if she was looking for a man who would manage her opinions for her, she should look somewhere else. That was when the clove-scented ribbon had appeared. He still wasn't entirely sure what it meant. He'd decided it meant all right then. Let's continue. The snow had picked up considerably by the time Cass came back inside. He stomped his boots at the door, shook his hat off, and looked at the letters spread across F's table without commenting on them. "It's dropping fast," Cass said. "Sky's got that particular ugly look." "I know. This isn't the regular early season stuff, F. This is shaping up to be something serious." He crossed to the stove, poured himself coffee. Stage from Cheyenne was due in today. If it got caught out on the pass, was already standing up. "Now hold on," Cass said quickly. "Hold on a minute. I'm not saying anything happened. I'm saying the weather is bad and getting worse, and you've been sitting here 2 hours reading those letters, and I can see exactly what you're thinking. Then I don't need to explain it." F. Cass set his cup down. His voice went quiet, the way it did when he was being serious instead of just conversational. "The pass is going to be brutal tonight. Dead Man's Pass in a blizzard is not a place you ride alone. I've ridden worse. When you were 26 and scouting for the Army and had nothing particular to lose." Cass looked at him steadily. "You've got something to lose now. The whole ranch to think about. The ranch will stand without me for one night. That's not what I meant, and you know it." EF picked up his coat from the hook by the door. It was heavy shearling, built for serious cold. He'd bought it specifically for nights like this. He shrugged into it, settled it on his shoulders, checked the pockets for his gloves. "Cass," he said, pausing at the door, "what would you have me do? Sit here and wait? She's out there somewhere. She took a stage from Cheyenne this morning, and that stage hasn't arrived, and the storm hit 3 hours ahead of schedule." He pulled his hat down and looked at his friend. "I gave her my word. I wrote it in a letter she has in her pocket right now, wherever she is. I told her I would meet her at that depot. The depot is empty, F. You already went. Then I'll find her before the depot." Cass rubbed the back of his neck. "You're going to get yourself killed. Maybe." F opened the door. Cold air hit them both like a fist. "But trust isn't something you give when the sun is shining and take back the moment a storm rolls in, Cass. I gave her my word, and a man on this frontier lives and dies by his word." Cass looked at him for a long moment. Then he exhaled through his nose, shook his head, and said, "Take the gray. Samson handles the deep snow better than the bay. Already planned on it. And take the extra bedroll from the already packed." Cass made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You'd already decided before you walked in the door, hadn't you?" F didn't answer that. He just stepped out into the snow. Samson was a big Percheron quarter cross, gray going white, with hooves the size of supper plates, and a disposition so steady it bordered on philosophical. F had owned him for 6 years and trusted him with his life on several occasions that I tried not to dwell on. The horse stood patient while F saddled him, blinking against the snow that was starting to blow sideways now, not seeming particularly concerned about any of it. F double-checked his saddlebags. Extra blanket, jerky and hardtack, matches sealed in wax cloth. His medical kit minimal, but it had what mattered. The Winchester in the scabbard was loaded. He was stalling. He knew he was stalling. He was standing in the barn door, looking out at the wall of white that the Wyoming night had become. And he was aware, with the particular clarity that cold and fear produced together, that riding out into that was an act of significant stupidity. He thought about Hetty's last letter. She'd written it 2 weeks ago, after he'd sent his formal proposal, such as it was. His proposal had been less than poetic. He'd told her the facts of the ranch, the facts of what he could offer, the facts of what he couldn't, and he'd said plainly that he wanted her to come, not because he needed someone to keep his house, but because 9 letters had convinced him she was someone worth knowing, and he was tired of knowing only horses and a handful of stubborn ranchers. She'd written back, "I have been offered marriage before, Mr. Thorne, by men who wanted a pretty ornament and called it a wife. I have declined all of them. I am accepting your proposal because your letters suggest you are offering something different. I expect to be held to that, and I will hold you to it in return. I'll arrive on the 21st. Don't be late." He'd read that letter 4 times in a row when it arrived. Then he'd gone out and worked the horses for 2 hours because he didn't know what else to do with the feeling it left behind. Don't be late. He'd been at that depot an hour before the train was due. He swung up into the saddle, settled his weight, gathered his reins. Samson shifted beneath him, lifted his head, reading the wind. Then he stepped forward, without being asked, out of the barn and into the dark and the white and the howling nothing of the storm. F pulled his hat brim down against the snow and set his jaw. The pass was 4 miles east. The stage road cut north of it, along the ridge above the ravine. If the storm had caught the coach out there, and the timing was right, it was precisely right. Then that's where they'd be. He didn't let himself finish that thought. He just rode. The snow swallowed the lights of the broken spear almost immediately. In 30 seconds, the barn was gone, the fence line was gone, and there was nothing in any direction except white darkness and the sound of the wind, which had a voice out here in open country, a low, continuous moan that changed pitch against the rock formations and sounded, on nights like this, almost human. F knew this land. He'd ridden every mile of it, in every season for 11 years. He knew the draw that flooded in spring, the ridge that collected ice first, the ravine that swallowed sound. He knew where the road went soft with runoff and where it turned hard and exposed on the high ground. He navigated by memory and by Samson's instincts and by the barely visible ghost of wheel ruts under the snow crust. He thought about Hetty Vance in the dark. He thought about her letters, the ink-stained practicality of them, the careful precision of her arguments, the moments where something warmer had slipped through, despite her evident determination to be measured about everything. The ribbon, the single line at the end of her 4th letter. "I think I might like you, Mr. Thorne, though I'll reserve final judgment until I see how you treat your horses." He'd sent a reply immediately. "They eat better than I do." She'd written back 2 days later, that is, improbably, the most reassuring thing you've said so far. The wind screamed across the ridge, and Samson lowered his head against it and kept moving, steady as a heartbeat, and F gave him his head and trusted him, and rode on into the blizzard, because that was the thing about a promise. It didn't get lighter when the weather turned bad. It got heavier. That was the whole point of it. He'd find her. He was going to find her. He kept riding. The great blizzard of 1888 did not announce itself politely. It arrived the way catastrophe usually does. Ahead of schedule, bigger than predicted, and with a kind of indifferent fury that made human plans feel like something written in water. The temperature had been dropping since noon. By the time F was 2 miles out of Garnet Falls, it had fallen another 15 degrees and was still going. The wind off the mountains had teeth in it now, real teeth, the kind that found the gap between your collar and your hat brim and went straight for the skin underneath. Dead Man's Pass earned its name in weather exactly like this. F had heard the stories from old-timers who'd been in the territory since before the railroad came through. Travelers who misjudged the pass in a storm. Cattle drives that turned into disasters in the space of an afternoon. The ravine below the North Ridge was 60 feet deep in places, choked with pine at the bottom, and when snow and ice built up on the road above it, the margin between the wheel ruts and open air got very thin very fast. He kept Samson to the inside edge of the road, away from the drop. The horse needed no instruction. He could feel where the ground went wrong, the same way F could, and he picked his way along the frozen ruts, with his ears flat against the wind and his big body angled sideways to keep his footing. The snow was coming horizontal now. F had his head down, hat brim pointed into the wind, and he was navigating mostly by feel. The slight resistance where the road was packed harder, the give of fresh powder over open ground, the way the sound changed when they were near the rock face on the left. He almost missed it. Samson stopped first. He planted his feet and threw his head up and refused to move, which was how F knew something was wrong even before he could see it. F trusted that horse the way he trusted his own senses. He sat still and let his eyes work. Something dark below the ridge line, angled wrong. He dismounted, looped Samson's reins around a pine branch, and moved toward the edge on foot. The stagecoach had gone off the road at the worst possible place, where the North Ridge curved outward and the drop below was straight and serious. It lay in the ravine at an ugly angle, one side buried in snow. The front axle snapped clean off and lodged 30 feet up the slope, where it had caught on an exposed root. The coach body itself was cracked along the roof. One door hung open, swinging slightly in the wind. The driver was at the bottom of the slope, half buried in snow. F went down to him, sliding on his heels, grabbing pine branches to control his descent. He crouched beside the man and put 2 fingers to his neck and held them there a long moment. Nothing. He was a big man, older, with a gray beard and a buffalo hide coat that hadn't been enough. The impact had done the real damage. His head had struck something on the way down, and there was dark matter frozen in the snow around him that told the rest of the story. He hadn't suffered long. That was something. Eve stayed crouched there for a moment. He hadn't known this driver personally, but he'd seen him at the depot often enough. Name was Purvis, he thought. Had a daughter somewhere down in Laramie. He stood up. He couldn't do anything for Purvis now, but he could figure out what had happened. The axle was what bothered him. He climbed back up to where it had lodged against the root and crouched over it, wiping snow from the metal. His lantern, he'd pulled it from his saddlebag before coming down, through a narrow orange circle of light over the break point, and he angled it and looked at it from 2 inches away. A clean fracture looks a certain way. Metal fails under stress along its grain, and the break point is rough and irregular, all splintered crystal and jagged edges. F had seen plenty of broken axles in his years. On the frontier, wagons and stages took punishment, and things gave way. This wasn't that. The bottom third of the break was smooth, deliberately smooth, with the particular parallel scoring that a saw blade leaves behind. Someone had cut most of the way through this axle with a metal saw, done it carefully, left enough material to hold under normal road conditions, and let the mountain pass do the rest. One good bump at the wrong moment, and the weight of the fully loaded coach would finish the job. F rocked back on his heels and looked at the dead man at the bottom of the ravine. This wasn't an accident. He'd heard things about Phineas Drake over the past year. Everyone in the valley had. Drake was buying up water rights through a combination of legal pressure and intimidation. And when those 2 tools failed to persuade, there were stories about what his men did instead. Fences cut, livestock spooked into ravines, a granary fire over in Sulphur Creek that nobody could prove anything about. Cutting a supply line to the valley in winter was exactly Drake's mathematics. Cut off the road, delay goods and mail for weeks, and the homesteaders who were already bleeding cash would bleed faster. It was calculated, it was efficient, and it was the kind of thing that was very hard to prove. Hetty had simply been on the wrong coach. F stood up, checked his lantern, and started looking for where she'd gone. There were 4 horses in the traces, or there had been. One had not survived the crash. Another was still alive but badly injured, lying on its side further into the trees, and F made the decision he had to make there quickly and without sentiment because the animal was suffering and he had no way to help it, and there was no time. He did what needed doing, and the sound was swallowed immediately by the storm. The other 2 horses were gone. He found the harness first, or rather, he found what was left of it. The traces cut through cleanly, the collar straps sliced at the attachment points, the chest strap severed in 2 places, not torn, not broken by panicked animals thrashing against the traces. Cut. Someone had deliberately freed at least one of those horses. He brought his lantern down close to the cut edges. The leather was clean through, a sharp blade drawn in controlled strokes by someone who knew what they were doing, someone who understood the anatomy of a harness. A bookbinder would. Bookbinding required precision cutting tools and the hand strength to use them on heavy material. Leather shears, specifically, left exactly this kind of edge straight, clean, produced by a single sustained pressure rather than the back and forth of a knife. F straightened up, slowly. Hetty Vance had been in this coach. The crash had happened, and instead of waiting in the wreckage to freeze slowly, she had taken her bookbinding tools and cut a draft horse free of the traces and ridden it out. He felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was something adjacent to admiration, and it was strong enough to be almost uncomfortable. He needed to find her trail. Fresh horse tracks in a blizzard don't last long. The wind fills them, the snow covers them, and within an hour, you're looking at an unbroken white surface with nothing to read. F had maybe 20 minutes of useful sign, if he was lucky, and he was already aware that he might not be lucky tonight. He worked outward from the harness in expanding arcs, keeping his lantern low to the ground, reading the snow surface the way his old Army scout commander had taught him to read ground in any weather. You don't look for the thing itself. You look for the disruption it left behind, the slightly different texture where something heavy passed, the tiny shadow that a compressed track throws under low light, the angle of disturbed snow crystals. He found the first track 20 yards north of the wreck, in a slight depression where the wind hadn't reached yet. Then another, then a third, and he had his line. The horse had gone north and slightly east, which was away from the road and into the timber. That made sense. A frightened animal would head for cover, and a rider trying to guide a bareback draft horse, with nothing but harness remnants for reins, would follow the animal's instincts rather than fight them. He followed the tracks for about a quarter mile before he found the scrap of fabric. It was caught on a low branch at knee height on foot, chest height on horseback. A strip of dark wool, maybe 4 inches wide and 8 inches long, torn ragged at both ends in a way that said it hadn't come off by accident. Someone had cut it free deliberately, with the same steady hands that had cut that harness. He held it up to the lantern. Dark burgundy wool, heavy winter weight. And there, even in the cold, even with the wind, the faintest ghost of a smell underneath the wet wool and the pine resin. Cloves. He stood there for 1 second, with his eyes closed. Just one. Then he looked at the fabric more carefully and understood what it was. She'd torn a strip from the hem of her traveling dress and used it as a bandage. The color at one end was wrong darker and stiffer, frozen now, but he'd seen enough field injuries to know what blood looked like after it dried and froze in cold weather. She was injured. He looked at the ground under the branch. In the sheltered space beneath a spruce with low-hanging boughs, the snow was shallower, and the tracks were clearer, and he could see that the horse's prints had changed here, from the steady, wide-spaced stride of a moving animal to a tighter, more irregular pattern. The animal had been laboring, and beyond this point, the trail went another 100 yards before the tracks changed character entirely. The horse had gone down. Not a gentle stumble. The snow showed a broad, disturbed area, thrashed and churned, where a large animal had struggled and then stopped struggling. The horse had collapsed from exhaustion and cold. It was the inevitable outcome of a draft horse ridden hard through deep snow with no saddle, no blanket, and no prior conditioning for that kind of work. And beyond the collapsed horse's final position, there were boot prints, small, narrow, made by someone walking with a very uneven gait, one foot landing with normal pressure and one landing light and then dragging slightly. One of her feet was injured badly enough that she couldn't put full weight on it. She was alive. She was hurt. She was on foot in a killing blizzard, and she was moving. F went back up to Samson at something close to a run. The hunter's line cabin was 3/4 of a mile northeast of where the horse had collapsed. F knew it existed. He'd sheltered in it himself once, years ago, when a summer storm had caught him out this way. It was built into the slope of a hillside with a sod roof, which was why it was easy to miss from a distance, and which was also why it was actually habitable in winter. The hillside insulated it. The low door kept the heat in. It was maybe 12 by 14 feet inside, with a stone fireplace and a plank bunk and not much else. But in a blizzard, it was worth more than a palace. He followed her boot prints through the timber. The trail was harder to read here. She'd been moving slower, and the wind reached down through the trees in gusts that disturbed the surface. But he kept it, lost it twice, found it again both times. She had moved in a reasonably straight line, which meant she either knew where the cabin was or she'd been lucky, and he was beginning to think that Hester Vance operated in some space between luck and intention that was hard to categorize from the outside. The cabin appeared out of the dark as a slightly darker dark, a rectangular mass with the hillside rising behind it. The door was pushed shut. No light showed through the shuttered window, but there was just barely, just at the edge of what was detectable, a thin gray thread of smoke from the chimney stack. She'd gotten a fire going. He dismounted, tied Samson on the leeward side of the cabin, where the hillside broke the wind, and put extra feed from his saddlebag in front of the horse. Then he knocked on the door. No answer. Miss Vance. He kept his voice level. My name is Ephraim Thorne. We've been corresponding through the Westward Horizons Agency. I'm going to open this door. He lifted the latch and pushed it open. The fire in the stone hearth was low, barely more than coals now, which meant she started it some hours ago, and it had been burning down while she was too weak to tend it. The cabin was dim and smoky and cold enough that his breath still fogged inside the door. She was on the plank bunk. She'd pulled something over herself, an old horse blanket she must have found on a peg, stiff with age and smelling strongly of mildew. And she was lying on her side, facing the fire, with her dark hair matted against her face, and her right boot cut open at the toe. Her foot, the bandage she'd made from her dress hem, was dark and stiff all the way through. He crossed to the fireplace first and built the fire back up. He needed light and heat both, and he needed them quickly. He worked fast, adding pine from the small stack someone had left inside. Thank God for that, whoever the last hunter threw had been, and getting the coals feeding again, until he had a real fire burning. Then he turned and crouched beside the bunk and put his hand carefully against her forehead. She was burning up. Her eyes opened. They were dark eyes, darker in the firelight, and they were not entirely focused. But they found his face, and they stayed there with a determination that told him something important about her. Even now, Thorne, she said. Her voice was wrecked dry and hoarse and thin. Yes, he said. You're late. He almost laughed. It came up from somewhere unexpected, and he caught it just in time, because laughing was not appropriate here. And he knew it, but the absurdity of her saying that injured, feverish, 36 hours into a blizzard. He held on to the fact of it like something valuable. I got held up, he said. Her eyes drifted half-closed. There was an accident. I know. I found the coach. He was already pulling his pack open, getting his canteen and the small kit he'd brought. I'm going to melt some snow and get you water. I need you to stay awake while I do that. I'm awake. You're going to feel like you want to sleep. Don't. I know the signs of hypothermia, Mr. Thorne. A pause. I've read about it. Reading about it and experiencing it are different things. I'm aware of that now. Yes, he got the canteen of snow, melting over the fire, and turned back to her. He needed to assess her foot. He needed to assess all of her, systematically the way he'd learned to assess injured men in the field start, with the things that could kill quickly and work down from there. I'm going to look at your foot, he said. Tell me if I'm hurting you. You'll know. He worked carefully, unwrapping the improvised bandage one layer at a time. She didn't make a sound, but he felt her flinch twice through the bunk frame, and he went slower at those moments. The foot itself was bad. The boot had protected it somewhat, but she'd taken a crushing blow. He guessed from the coach door or a falling piece of the frame during the crash, and the cold had done additional damage in the hours since. Two toes were dark, and the skin around the ball of her foot was wrong. He'd seen frostbite before. He'd treated it in the field with limited resources. He knew what it meant when tissue went that color. He didn't say any of that out loud. He would deal with what he could deal with now and think about the rest when he had more information. He melted snow on a cloth and began warming the foot slowly. Not rubbing you never rubbed frostbitten tissue, just gentle, steady heat, moving up her leg in increments to help the blood return gradually. She watched him work. When he glanced up, she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, measuring, maybe, or trying to. "You came," she said. "I said I would. Most people say things." She shifted slightly on the bunk and winced. The saying and the doing are usually different quantities. "Not for me." He kept his hand steady on her foot, gentle and deliberate. "How long have you been here?" Since she stopped, seemed to think about it. "The coach went over in the early afternoon yesterday. I think it's been a day and a half. Approximately, I lost some time. A day and a half. In this cold, injured, with a fire, she'd somehow managed to start in a strange cabin with limited resources." He looked at the fireplace. She'd stacked the wood correctly, built the initial fire smart, positioned herself close enough for heat, but not close enough to be a danger. Even delirious with fever and pain, she had done things right. "Your tools," he said. "You cut the harness. With my shears?" "Yes, I have them in my bag." She gestured vaguely toward the floor. It seemed more useful than waiting to freeze inside the coach. And Dolores, the horse, was the calmer of the two, and I felt confident she would take a rider if I was careful about how I approached her. "You named the horse." "I had to call her something. We were together for 40 minutes. A pause. I'm sorry I couldn't save her." F said nothing for a moment. He looked at this woman, this feverish, injured, sharp-tongued woman who had cut a draft horse free with her bookbinding shears and ridden it bareback through a Wyoming blizzard, named it, and was sorry she couldn't save it. And he thought that the men in Garnet Falls who'd used the phrase soft city woman were the single most incorrect collection of human beings he'd ever encountered. He got her water warm from the now melted snow and helped her drink it in careful sips. He wrapped his bedroll around her and added the horse blanket over that. He sat on the edge of the bunk and put another piece of pine on the fire. Outside, the storm sounded like it was trying to take the mountain apart. "You should try to sleep," he said. "You said not to sleep. That was before I got your core temperature back up. Sleep is different now." He looked at her. "I'll keep the fire." She was quiet for a moment. Her eyes were at half-mast, the fever dragging at her. "Mr. Thorne," she said. F. She tried it out, slow and deliberate. "I want you to know that I intend to be useful. Once my foot heals, I have plans for your ranch accounts, and I've been reading about horse breeding, and I—" She stopped, swallowed, and then, very quietly, and in a voice that had nothing of her usual precision in it, "I am not going to be a burden to you. I want you to know that." He looked at her for a long moment in the firelight. "Hetty," he said. Her eyes opened fully at her name. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll talk about the rest when the storm breaks." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she closed her eyes, and her breathing slowed, and the firelight moved across her face, and outside the blizzard continued its work. F fed the fire. He checked the door. He sat with his back against the stone of the fireplace wall, and listened to the storm, and watched the door, and kept watch, the way he'd kept watch through 100 cold nights that were nothing like this one, and somehow felt, tonight, like they'd all been leading here. He didn't sleep. He wasn't going anywhere. Dawn came slowly in the mountains, and in a blizzard, it barely came at all. What passed for morning light filtered through the gaps in the cabin's shuttered window as a thin gray seam, barely enough to see by. The fire had burned low again. F had tended it through the night in cycles, feeding it, letting it drop, feeding it again, managing the cabin's warmth, the way you manage anything scarce and essential, with attention and without waste. He hadn't slept. He'd thought about it once, around what he judged to be 3 in the morning, and decided against it. Hetty's fever was real, and her foot was serious, and they were alone in a blizzard in a cabin with one door, and no way to know what was moving around outside in the dark. Sleep could wait. She'd slept hard. That was good. The body heals what it can when you're unconscious. And, fever or not, she needed rest more than anything else he could offer her right now. He'd checked her temperature by touch every hour or so, his hand to her forehead, careful not to wake her. And the fever had climbed through the middle of the night before it started, slowly, to retreat. By the time the gray light came through the window gap, she was cooler. Still warm, but cooler. He had the snow melted and water heating over the fire when she woke up. She came back to consciousness the way someone does, after real exhaustion. Not gradually, not with any of the soft blinking you saw in people who'd had a comfortable night. She came back all at once, eyes opening full, body going tense for just a second before she placed herself. Before she remembered where she was and why, she looked at the ceiling of the cabin. Then she turned her head and looked at him. "You're still here," she said. "Where else would I be?" I thought. She stopped, tried to push herself up onto one elbow and made it about halfway before she stopped again. I wasn't entirely coherent last night. I wasn't certain how much of what I remembered was real. "What do you remember?" "You built the fire up. You warmed my foot. You gave me water." She studied him across the small space of the cabin. "You told me to sleep. That was real. Good." She got herself up onto the elbow properly and looked at her foot. It was wrapped now. He'd used the cleanest strips from his kit and elevated on a folded piece of his bedroll. She looked at it for a moment with an expression that was very controlled. "How bad?" "Bad enough that we need to get you to a doctor in Garnet Falls." "That's not what?" I asked. He met her eyes. She was right. It wasn't what she'd asked, and she deserved a direct answer. "The crushing injury is serious. 2 toes on your right foot are frostbitten, and the tissue at the ball of your foot is compromised. I've done what I can here. It isn't enough." She absorbed that. She didn't look away from him while she did it. "The frostbitten toes," she said. "Are we talking about loss of sensation or loss of the toes themselves?" "I don't know yet. That's a question for a physician with better light and proper instruments." He poured water into the tin cup he'd found on the cabin's single shelf and crossed to her. "Drink this, slowly." She took the cup in both hands. He noticed her hands were steady. That was interesting, given everything. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. We still have to get you out of here. In this storm, when it breaks." He crouched to look at the fire. "It's been blowing hard for 18 hours. These systems don't last more than another few hours at this intensity, usually. We'll have a window. And if we don't, then we wait for the next one." She sipped the water and didn't say anything for a moment. He could hear the storm outside, still serious, still loud, but with a slightly different quality than it had through the night. Less continuous, more in gusts. "My bag," she said. "Is it here?" "On the floor by the bunk." She leaned over carefully and retrieved it herself, pulling it up onto the bunk beside her. It was a leather satchel, dark brown, well-made and well-used, with brass fittings that had gone slightly green at the edges. She opened it and looked inside in a businesslike way, taking stock of what had survived the crash and the ride and the night. F watched her without being obvious about it. She moved with purpose, even injured, and still running a low fever. Every action had direction. She checked her tools first. He could see the handles of several instruments in a canvas roll, the kind of organized kit a craftsperson builds over years. Then a small notebook, a folded document that she checked and refolded and put back carefully. Some personal items he didn't look at directly. A pair of spectacles in a hard case. "My letters are gone," she said. Not with distress, just reporting a fact. "They were in your bag, in my traveling case, which was in the boot of the coach." She paused. "I couldn't take the case when I went for the horse. Too heavy to manage and still mount his letters. Hers were in his tin box at home, but his apparently had gone down with the coach and were likely buried under 4 feet of snow in a Wyoming ravine." "I can write them again," he said. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, just a slight change at the corners of her eyes. "You'd remember what you wrote?" "Most of it," So would I, she said. Then she looked back at her bag and continued her inventory. He made a kind of breakfast from his saddlebag supplies. Hardtack softened in hot water, a piece of jerky for each of them, and strong coffee from the small amount of grounds he'd packed in waxed paper. It wasn't much. It was enough. She ate without complaint. He appreciated that. There was a category of person who, in difficult circumstances, narrated their discomfort constantly. The cold, the food, the situation, as though talking about it, would change it. Hetty was not that. She ate the softened hardtack and drank the coffee and seemed to be thinking about something else entirely. Tell me about the axle, she said. He paused with his cup halfway to his mouth. What do you know about the axle? I know the coach went over at the curve above the ravine, which is where the road is most difficult. But I also know that Purvis, the driver, was experienced on this route. I'd spoken to him at the Cheyenne station. He knew that road. She set down her cup. And I know that the crash was very sudden. No gradual loss of control. The front of the coach just dropped, all at once. He told her what he'd found. The saw marks, the calculated depth of the cut, the way the remaining metal had been left deliberately to hold under normal conditions and fail under stress. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Purvis, she said. Yes, I'm sorry. She looked at the fire. He had a daughter in Laramie. He mentioned her. Another pause. So this was deliberate. Someone wanted to close this road. That's what the evidence suggests. Then I need to tell you something. She reached into her satchel and retrieved the folded document she'd checked earlier. I was carrying mail. There was a packet given to me at the Cheyenne station by the postmaster there to deliver to Garnet Falls since the regular mail service has been delayed. I took it because it seemed a useful thing to do. She held up the document. This particular envelope was separate from the mail packet, handed to me personally by a man at the Cheyenne station who said he was a territorial court clerk. He asked me to deliver it to the county courthouse at Garnet Falls. What's in it? I don't know. It's sealed. She turned it over. The seal was intact red wax, pressed with a stamp he couldn't make out from where he sat. But the clerk was nervous when he gave it to me. He kept looking over his shoulder. And he told me, specifically, not to discuss it with anyone at the station. F looked at the envelope for a long moment. A sealed document from a territorial court clerk, delivered by a nervous man who didn't want to be observed doing it. A mail route sabotaged to cut off the valley. A dead driver. He thought about Phineas Drake. Keep it in your bag, he said. Keep it on your person. She was already putting it back. That was already my intention. The fever came back mid-morning. He saw it before she acknowledged it. The slight flush returning to her face, the way her eyes lost their sharpness at the edges, the fine tension that came into her jaw when she was working to maintain her focus. He'd kept the fire steady and kept her warm and given her water at regular intervals. But a body-fighting infection doesn't care about good management. It does what it does. Your fever is rising again, he said. I'm aware of that. You need to lie down. I'm sitting up, Hetty. I'm not, she stopped, drew a careful breath. I'm not accustomed to being managed. I'm not managing you. I'm telling you what's medically true. He kept his voice even. Your body is fighting an infection. Fighting costs energy. Energy is heat. If you spend your heat sitting up being determined, you'll have less of it for the infection. Lie down. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated and interesting and that he didn't have a word for. Then she lay down. Thank you, he said. I want it noted that I'm doing this because the logic is sound, not because you told me to. Noted. He pulled the blankets up around her and added another piece of wood to the fire. She was watching the ceiling again, her jaw still set, her hands flat at her sides, like a person who was determined to be horizontal with dignity. The foot, she said. I can feel it more now than I could last night. That's actually a better sign than not feeling it, is it? Sensation returning to frostbitten tissue means circulation is restoring. The alternative is permanent nerve damage. He settled back against the wall near the fire. I'd rather you feel it. Easy for you to say. True, she almost smiled. He caught it at the corner of her mouth before she contained it. He checked the foot, then unwrapped it carefully, assessed what he could see in the firelight, rewrapped it with fresh material from his kit. The two darkened toes were concerning. He'd seen worse outcomes. from less, and better outcomes from worse, and he genuinely didn't know which way this would go. But the skin surrounding the frostbite had better color than it had at midnight, and that was something. She watched him work, with her face turned toward him, and her dark eyes tracking every movement, not with anxiety, with attention. "You've done this before," she said. "Field medicine. I was an Army scout for 8 years. Union? Yes. Where? Virginia, mostly. Some of the Tennessee campaigns." He kept his hand steady on the wrapping. "You've read about the war?" "I was 12 when it ended. But yes, I've read about it. My father had strong opinions." She paused. "He was an abolitionist. He used our parlor for meetings. That would have been dangerous, depending on the company he kept. It was sometimes." She was quiet for a moment. "He believed that a person's worth was not determined by their circumstances of birth. He said it often enough that I eventually stopped being able to think any other way." Another pause, softer. "I miss him." F tied off the wrapping and sat back. "When did you lose him? 4 years ago." "My mother the year after." She looked at the ceiling. "After that, I was living in Philadelphia on a schoolteacher's salary, which is not a large salary, and my employer informed me that the school board preferred unmarried female teachers to remain. Their word was appropriate in their personal conduct and associations, which meant, in practice, that they expected to have opinions about my life outside the classroom." The corner of her mouth moved. "I had some difficulty with that, I imagine." "I'm a good teacher," she said. "That should be sufficient." "It should be." When I saw the agency's advertisement, she stopped, seemed to consider how much to say. "I was not looking for rescue. I want to be clear about that. I was looking for a situation where I could be useful on my own terms, where what I contributed was valued without requiring me to shrink myself to fit someone else's idea of what I should be. Your letters made that clear. Did they bother you?" "No. Most men." She stopped again. "I'm not most men," he said. It wasn't arrogant. It was just a statement of observed fact. She looked at him directly for a moment. "No," she said. "I'm beginning to think you're not." The fever peaked around noon. He knew it had peaked because she stopped being careful about what she said. The discipline that kept her voice measured and her words chosen loosened the way it does when a person's body is using all available resources for something more urgent than social management. She talked some, not continuously, but in stretches, about her father's meetings in the parlor, about a student she'd had once who'd memorized every county in Pennsylvania and recited them in order when he was nervous, about a book she was in the middle of rebinding when she'd left Philadelphia, an old natural history text with illustrations of Wyoming birds that had made her curious about what was out here. He listened to all of it. He answered when she was asking something and stayed quiet when she was just talking. He kept the water coming and the fire steady and her temperature monitored. Then the talking stopped and something else started. It came on the way bad things often do quietly. At first, then all at once. Her breathing changed, going shallow and fast. Her hands, which had been still, started moving restlessly against the blanket. And then she was crying, not the controlled kind, not the kind a person manages and is aware of. It came from somewhere deeper than awareness, from the place where the fever and the pain and 36 hours of sheer survival had collected and were now, without her conscious permission, coming out. She wept with her hands pressed against her face and her whole body shaking with it, and the sound was one that F had to actively work not to look away from, because it was private and real, and very hard to witness. He moved to the edge of the bunk and crouched there, heady. She shook her head behind her hands. Then she said, muffled and broken, "Don't abandon me." He went very still. "Don't," her voice fractured completely. "I know I can't." The foot. "And I don't know yet how bad. I don't know if I can work a ranch, if I can ride, if I'll be." She couldn't finish it. She tried twice and couldn't. What came out instead, desperate and quiet, was, "Don't abandon me now that I'm a cripple who can't work a ranch." The fire cracked. Outside, the storm gusted and then dropped, the wind cycling through one of its intervals of near silence. F reached out and took her hands, both of them, drawing them gently away from her face and wrapping them in his, scarred, rough, oversized hands around her smaller ones, which were cold despite the fire, shaking despite her strength. He waited until she looked at him. Her eyes were red and bright, with fever and tears, and something underneath both of those that was just plain fear. The fear of a person who has been strong for a very long time and is terrified of what happens if they're not strong enough now. He held her gaze, and he spoke carefully, because this mattered, and he didn't want to get it wrong. "Hetty," he said, "I didn't put an ad in the paper looking for a hired hand to work into the ground. I was looking for a partner." He kept his voice steady and low. "Your worth isn't measured by whether you can outrun a horse. It's in your mind, your courage, and your soul." She looked at him. The shaking in her hands was slowing. "You rode a draft horse bareback through a blizzard," he said. "You cut that harness with your own tools. You found this cabin. You built that fire. You kept yourself alive for 36 hours in conditions that kill experienced frontiersmen." He let that sit. "Tell me what part of that is not someone worth partnering with." She didn't answer right away. She looked at his hands around hers, then back at his face. "What if the foot she started? We don't know yet what the foot is going to be." His voice was honest. "I won't lie to you about that. I don't know, and you don't know. And Dr. Morrison will be the one to tell us. But I'm going to tell you something, I mean absolutely. Whatever Morrison says, it changes nothing about why I came out here." He paused. "I came for the woman who wrote me 9 letters. That woman is still here. She's right here. The rest we'll figure out." She was quiet for a long time. Her breathing steadied. The shaking stopped, then she said, very quietly, 9 letters. 9, you counted. I keep them in a tin box." Something moved through her face that was too complicated to name and too real to look away from. She didn't pull her hands back. He didn't let go of them yet, either. They stayed like that for a moment, both of them still in the firelight, while the storm outside ran through another cycle of fury and then subsided into something slightly less than fury. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I'm not usually." "You've been awake for 2 days in a blizzard with a crushed foot and a fever," he said. "There's no apology required. I'm not someone who falls apart. I know that. Falling apart for 5 minutes after what you've been through isn't falling apart. It's being human." He sat back slightly. "Lie back down." She lay back. She didn't argue this time. The fever had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit, and the outburst, which she would probably think about with embarrassment later when she was stronger, and which he had no intention of letting her be embarrassed about, had spent something in her that she needed to rest now to get back. He checked the water, heated it again, gave her more. She drank it with her eyes half closed. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. Her voice was drowsy. "What about it? The horses? What kind?" A pause. "I'd like to think about something specific," he considered. "Mostly quarter horses. 3 mares, 2 stallions, 8 geldings. I breed the mares for working stock. They go to cattle ranchers in the valley who need horses that can handle terrain and weather and sustained work. I've got 1 stallion who's a good cross with a Morgan for producing light cavalry types, and another that's more of a draft cross for heavy work." Her eyes were fully closed now. "What are they called?" "The horses?" "Yes." He told her their names. He told her about the bay mare, who was particular about, who brushed her out and would pin her ears at strangers, but was the most sure-footed animal he'd ever ridden on mountain trails. About the younger stallion who was still working out his personality, but showed promise. About Samson, who was outside right now, and how he'd come to own him. She was asleep before he finished. He let the room settle into quiet, just the fire and the wind and her breathing, which was slow, and even now, and the occasional shift of Samson moving outside. He tended to the foot twice more during the afternoon. Each time he was thorough and gentle and careful, working by firelight and by touch in the dimmer corners of the cabin. He'd learned field medicine from necessity. The Army had a way of putting you in situations that required knowledge you didn't have yet, and the effective ones learned fast. He knew how to manage cold injuries, how to reduce swelling, how to prevent the secondary infections that were often more deadly than the initial trauma. What he couldn't do here was enough. He knew that. The 2 darkened toes worried him more each hour. Tissue that went that color in freezing temperatures and stayed that color after warming had begun to die, and dead tissue in a wound was a problem that got worse, not better, with time. The longer they stayed in this cabin, the more that risk compounded. He needed to get her to Morrison's clinic. He checked the storm at intervals, opening the door a crack and reading what he could of the sky and the wind. Around 3 in the afternoon, the character changed. Still heavy, still serious, but the worst of the horizontal driving snow had eased. The gusts were further apart. The cloud ceiling, what he could see of it through the trees, had risen slightly. The storm was cycling down. Not over, not safe, but moving toward a window. He woke her carefully when he'd made his assessment. Hetty. He touched her shoulder lightly. I need to talk to you about the next few hours. She came back quickly, faster than he expected from how deeply she'd been sleeping. Her eyes focused on him, and then on the fire, and then on the barely perceptible increase in the gray light at the window seam. The storm is breaking, she said. Partially. I think we've got a window opening up. It won't last long. I want to move you to town while I can. He looked at her steadily. It's going to be rough. Samson can carry double, but not comfortably in this snow. And I'll have to manage him carefully on the trail back to the road. You're going to have to hold on and trust me. And if the wind picks back up, we may have to stop and wait. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. He could see her calculating the discomfort of the journey against the risk of staying. And if we stay, she said, the foot gets worse, possibly significantly worse. He didn't soften it. She wouldn't want him to. You need Morrison to look at it. Today, if possible. She sat up, slow and careful and deliberate. And when she got upright, she stayed there without swaying, which was something. All right, she said.
Let's go.
I'll bring Samson around. You stay put until I do. I'm capable of hopping to the door on one foot in the snow to prove a point. Yes, I can see that. He picked up his coat. Give me 3 minutes. He was almost to the door when she said, F. He turned. She was sitting on the edge of the bunk, with her hands folded in her lap and her chin level. And she looked at him with an expression that was composed and careful. And underneath all of that, genuinely grateful, in a way she was clearly not practiced at expressing. Thank you, she said. Not just for coming. She paused. For what you said earlier, about worth. She stopped there, like she'd said what she meant, and didn't want to add anything that would soften or dilute it. He nodded. 3 minutes, he said, and went out. Getting her onto Samson was a problem they solved practically and without ceremony. F brought the horse as close to the cabin door as the ground allowed, and he built a step from the firewood stacked 2 rounds of pine stacked and placed flat, so she had something solid to push off from with her good foot. She'd wrapped herself in every layer available, his bedroll around her shoulders, her wool coat underneath, and she held her bag across her chest. She got onto Samson from the step in one movement, graceless and painful, and accomplished entirely under her own power. She was up before he'd fully registered that she'd committed to the attempt. She settled behind the saddle with her hands on his waist, and her jaw set hard against whatever the foot was doing. Ready, she said. He mounted in front of her, gathered the reins, and pointed Samson's head toward the road. The trees closed in around them, dark and heavy with accumulated snow. The wind moved through the canopy above with a low, continuous voice. Samson walked steady, reading the ground, taking his time. Behind him, Hetty Vance sat straight-backed and held on, and did not make a sound. They rode toward Garnet Falls, through the gray afternoon, the storm breathing cold around them, the document sealed in red wax tucked against her ribs inside her coat, and neither of them knowing yet what was going to be waiting for them when they arrived. But they were moving, together, and that for now was enough. They were maybe 40 minutes from the cabin when Samson's ears went forward. F felt it before he saw it, a change in the horse's stride, a subtle gathering of attention that traveled up through the saddle leather and into his legs. Samson didn't spook. He'd been around enough genuine danger in his years to know the difference between a startled reaction and a real warning. And what he was doing now was the real kind. Head up, ears pinned forward and slightly apart, nostrils working. F's hand went to the Winchester in the scabbard and stopped there without drawing it. What is it? Hetty said quietly, behind him. Don't know yet. He kept his voice low. Hold still. The trail back to the main road ran through a 1/4 mile of mixed timber before it opened onto the exposed ridge. They were still in the trees, the canopy above them, muffling the wind, the snow coming down in the slower, vertical way it fell when there was shelter overhead. Visibility was maybe 30 yards ahead, less in the places where the undergrowth crowded the trail. He listened, wind in the upper branches, Samson's breathing, the soft compression of snow under the horse's feet, then something else, faint, the creak of dead wood under a weight it hadn't been asked to carry before. Something was moving through the timber to their left, roughly parallel to the trail, and it was moving at a pace that suggested purpose. Two men, F said quietly. At least. Hetty's hands tightened slightly at his waist. Drake's? Most likely. He was already calculating angles. The trail here ran between two slight rises good cover on both sides, which cut both ways. They're heading for the cabin. To clean up the evidence, she said. She'd put it together fast. The axle, the harness. They need to remove it before anyone can examine it. Yes, and they'll shelter there once they do. In the storm, he thought about the timing. Two men sent to remove evidence of the sabotage, arriving at the cabin to find it occupied by the very people who'd survived the crime they were trying to erase. That was a problem of a particular order. He could angle Samson off the trail now, cut east, through the timber, try to swing wide of them and let them pass. It was the cautious choice. It was probably the smart choice. If they could get to Garnet Falls without an encounter, they'd have Morrison and Cass, and the backing of a town between them and Drake's men, and that was a better position to operate from than a dark forest in a blizzard. He started to rein Samson east. The men came out of the timber on the left side of the trail, 20 yards ahead, and they weren't being quiet about it anymore. Two of them, heavy coats, hats pulled down, one carrying a rifle across his chest, and the other with a revolver already in his hand. They pulled up when they saw F and Samson, and for about 2 seconds nobody moved. Then the one with the rifle said, "That's them." The first shot went wide, high and left, which told F the shooter was cold and hadn't given the rifle time to come fully to shoulder. He put his heels into Samson, and the horse lunged sideways off the trail into the trees on the right before the second shot came. And the second shot hit bark somewhere behind them and sprayed ice and splinters into the cold air. "Get down behind the saddle," F said. He didn't wait to see if Hetty complied. He was already off Samson, landing in knee-deep snow and using the horse's body as cover while he got the Winchester out of the scabbard. Samson stood where he'd been put, trained and steady, which was worth more right now than almost anything. F came around the horse's hindquarters and took a position behind a pine with a trunk thick enough to matter. The two men had split. That was the right tactical move, which meant they'd done something like this before. One had gone back into the timber on the left side of the trail. The other, the one with the revolver, had moved forward and was now somewhere in the undergrowth ahead and to EF's right. They were trying to bracket him. EF had played this game before, in worse terrain with worse odds. He stayed still. In a gunfight in heavy timber, the first person to move was usually the first person to die. He pressed his back against the pine, controlled his breathing, and waited. The man in the timber to the left fired again. The shot came from about 15 yards in, which was close enough to be concerning, and far enough that the timber between them was working in EF's favor. He marked the muzzle flash, waited 3 seconds, and put a round from the Winchester into the space 2 feet to the left of where the flash had been. He heard something. A sharp intake of breath, then movement, then silence. Not dead, but discouraged. The second man, the one with the revolver, the one F couldn't see, was the problem. He tracked the man by sound. Footsteps in snow made a distinctive compression sound. And if you'd spent years reading the world through sound and sign and the slant of disturbed undergrowth, you could follow a man by it pretty well. The second gunman was circling, coming around to the east, trying to get an angle on F's position from behind the pine. F moved. He left the pine and went low and fast through the snow, 3 big steps to the right, and dropped behind a fallen log just as the revolver cracked from behind his previous position. He was behind the shooter now, roughly. He came up from behind the log with the Winchester leveled and said, "Drop it." The man spun. He was maybe 25 feet away, half visible through the undergrowth, and for a moment, F thought he was going to be sensible about it. The revolver hand wavered. Then from behind, F, the first man, the one he'd discouraged with the return, shot called out. Hennessy, the cabin. Hennessy, the one with the revolver, looked at F and made a decision. He turned and ran for the trail, crashing through the undergrowth in the direction of the cabin, his partner doing the same from the other side. F tracked him with the Winchester and held two running men in heavy timber with diminishing light. He could take the shot. He probably could make it. But a wounded man in a blizzard was its own problem, and a dead man was a different set of problems entirely. And there was a calculus to these situations that his years in the army had taught him to think through before he pulled the trigger. He let them run. They were going to the cabin that was empty now because he and Hetty had left it an hour ago. They'd find nothing there but a fire that had burned down and snow that was already filling in the boot prints. It bought time. He went back to Samson. Hetty was still in the saddle. She'd gotten low. He could see she'd pressed herself down along the horse's neck during the shooting, which was the right instinct. But she was upright again now, watching him come through the trees with an expression that was pale and composed, and doing a lot of work to stay that way. "Are you hurt?" he said immediately. "No." She looked at him carefully. "Are you?" "No." He checked Samson, quickly ran his hands over the horse's neck and flanks, looking for anything the shots might have found. "Nothing," he exhaled. "They've gone to the cabin. We need to move now, while they're occupied. How long do we have?" "Until they figure out we were there recently and pick up our trail." He was already up in the saddle. 15 minutes, maybe 20 if they're thorough with the cabin search. He pushed Samson back onto the trail and moved him into the best pace the snow allowed, which was faster now on the packed surface of the trail, where other traffic had compressed the drifts. Hetty said nothing for a few minutes. He could feel her thinking. Then she said, "The one you drove back into the timber, did you hit him?" "Clipped him, I think. Enough to slow him down. But he ran anyway. People do surprising things when they're scared." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "He'll be hurting but mobile. They'll both be after us once they've checked the cabin. Then we can't stop." "No." The trail widened as it approached the main road, the timber thinning out, and the sky opening up above them. What was left of the afternoon light was flat and gray, the sun somewhere above the cloud cover, doing nothing useful. The wind had picked back up, not the sustained howl of the previous night, but serious gusts that drove the snow sideways in periodic sweeps and cut the visibility down to 50 yards. F pushed Samson as hard as he dared. The horse was tired. He'd stood in the cold all night and into the morning, had carried double weight for going on 2 hours now, and the deep snow on the open stretches demanded more from him than the packed trail had. He gave what he was asked for without complaint. But F could feel the difference in his stride. Behind him, Hetty was quieter than she'd been. He glanced back once. She was still upright, still holding on, but her face had a particular quality of concentration to it that he recognized as the look of someone managing significant pain by directing their attention somewhere other than the source of it. Her right foot, wrapped and elevated as best it could be while riding, had been jostled through 2 hours of mountain trail and a gunfight and a hurried retreat through heavy snow. "How bad is it?" he said. She knew what he meant without clarification. "Manageable, Hetty." "I said manageable. I mean manageable." A breath. "It's worse than it was this morning. I'm aware that's significant, but I can hold on until we reach town. Tell me if that changes." "You'll know if it changes," she said. Her voice had some of its old edge in it, which he found reassuring. They came out onto the main road, and he turned Samson south toward Garnet Falls. 20 minutes later, he heard them. Not both of them. One horse, moving fast on the road behind them. The other man was either too injured to ride hard, or was flanking on a different route. But one of them was coming, and he was closing the distance. F checked the Winchester. He had 4 rounds left in the magazine, which was not a comfortable number. His revolver on his hip was fully loaded. He measured the geometry of the situation: open road, fading light, a horse carrying double who was already working at his limit. He couldn't outrun one fresh horse with Samson at this weight. He needed to make a choice. "Rider behind us," he said. Hetty turned her head. He felt her shift slightly. "How far?" "Quarter mile. Closing." "Can Samson outpace him?" "Not with both of us." He said it straight. She needed the information. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then let me off. No, F, if you let me off here, I can take cover in that ravine and you can... No. His voice was flat. We stay together. That's not rational. We stay together. He reined Samson around a drift and looked for a position. Ahead on the road there was a bend, and on the outside of the bend a rock outcropping where the road cut close to the hillside. The rock face would give him a position on the rider's approach. Hold on tight. He pushed Samson off the road and around behind the rock outcropping, getting the horse into the shelter of it where he couldn't be seen from the road. He got down fast, got the Winchester up, and moved to the edge of the rock where he could see the bend. The rider came around the bend at a canter, moving too fast for conditions, which told F he was either reckless or desperate. It was the man from the timber, the one with the revolver. Hennessy. He had the revolver out, held across the pommel. He was 50 feet out when he saw the empty road and pulled up. F stepped out from behind the outcropping with the Winchester to his shoulder. Drop the gun. Hennessy went absolutely still. I won't ask twice, F said. The revolver dropped into the snow. Get off the horse. Hennessy dismounted slowly. He was a young man, younger than F had registered in the timber, with a thin face and reddened eyes that might have been from the cold or might have been something else. There was blood on his left coat sleeve from the earlier exchange, soaking through the heavy wool in a dark patch from shoulder to elbow. Not a graze, a real hit. Where's your partner? F said. Gone back. Hennessy's voice was sullen and careful. Said this weren't worth it. Smart man. F kept the rifle on him. Take your right hand and reach inside your coat slowly and tell me what you're carrying. Hennessy produced a folding knife. F told him to put it in the snow next to the revolver. Now walk. F nodded down the road, away from town. Keep your hands where I can see them. I'll freeze. You've got a coat and boots and you're 1.5 miles from the cabin. Move. Hennessy looked at him with an expression that was calculating and afraid in equal measure. Then he turned and started walking. F watched him go until he was a gray shape at the edge of visibility, then turned back to Samson. He retrieved the revolver from the snow and checked it, loaded, good condition, and tucked it into his saddlebag. Evidence. Hetty was watching him from the saddle. He swung up in front of her without a word and urged Samson back onto the road. They rode in silence for a while. The light was dropping steadily now, what passed for afternoon giving way to a flat gray early dusk that had no particular color in it. Then Hetty said, that arm wound was serious. Yes, he could freeze before he makes the cabin. He could. Kept his eyes on the road. He could also make the cabin in 40 minutes. If he moves at a decent pace, which a young man with a wound to the arm and functional legs is capable of doing. A pause. I'm not leaving him out here to die, Hetty. I'm leaving him with enough distance between us to get you to a doctor. She was quiet for a moment. Then I wasn't objecting. I know I was that too. The real problem declared itself about 1 mile outside Garnet Falls. F had known it was coming, had felt it building in the way. Hetty's grip at his waist had changed over the past hour, going from firm and controlled to something with a faint trembling in it that had nothing to do with cold. He'd been tracking the change the way he tracked everything out here, quietly, consistently, without making a point of it. But when she said his name, quietly, without urgency, just his name, he pulled Samson up immediately. Tell me, he said. A pause. I need you to know that I'm not going to faint. I want to be clear about that. But the pain as she stopped, drew a breath that he could feel against his back. Something has changed. In the last half hour. I can feel it, and it isn't what it was before. He got down and came around to her side and looked at the foot. The wrapping was still in place, but he could see, even through the cloth and the dim light, that the swelling had increased significantly. The ankle above the wrapping was puffy in a way it hadn't been when he'd dressed it at the cabin. He looked at her face. Pale, very pale, and the particular pale of someone whose body is working very hard to keep them upright and conscious. How far? She said. 1 mile. Less. Then we go, Hetty. 1 mile, F. Her chin came up. I have come this far. I can do 1 more mile. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled the remaining blanket from the saddlebag and wrapped it more securely around the foot, building some padding and immobilizing it as best he could, and got back up and pushed Samson into as smooth a walk as the road allowed. He felt her forehead against his back, not leaning, just resting there for a moment. One single moment of allowing herself to be tired, and then she straightened up again. He didn't say anything about it. The lights of Garnet Falls came through the gray dusk like something genuinely welcome, which was not a feeling F normally had about towns. There were maybe 200 people in Garnet Falls, which made it substantial by Wyoming territory standards. It had a main street with a general store, a saloon, a feed and tack operation, a small bank, and a church at the far end. It also had a physician, Dr. Harrison Morrison, who'd come west from Ohio 12 years ago with his wife, Sarah, and had apparently decided that frontier medicine was preferable to whatever he'd left behind, which F had never inquired about. Morrison's clinic was on the north end of Main Street, a wood-frame building with a light burning in the front window. Sarah Morrison kept that light burning from dusk until midnight every night, on the theory that people in need of a doctor often needed one at inconvenient hours and shouldn't have to guess whether they'd found the right building. F pulled Sampson up to the hitching post and dismounted. Cass Hayes was standing on the boardwalk outside the clinic. He was in his heavy work coat with his bad arm tucked close to his body against the cold, and he looked at F coming around the horse with an expression of profound relief that he converted immediately into a scowl. "You've been gone 26 hours, Cass said. "I know. I counted, I know, Cass." Cass looked past him at Hetty on the horse. He looked at her for a moment, taking in the state of her. The pallor, the wrapped foot, the set of her jaw, all of it. His expression shifted into something that wasn't the scowl. "Miss Vance," he said. He moved forward to the horse's side and stood there looking up at her with a directness that was entirely respectful. "I'm Cassian Hayes. Cass, I'm going to help you get down from there if you'll allow it." Hetty looked at him. She took in the crippled arm, the big capable right hand, the straightforward offer in his voice. "Cass," she said. "Yes, thank you." Between the two of them, Cass on one side, F on the other, they got her down from the saddle without putting weight on the foot. She was lighter than F had expected, which told him she'd been running on reserves for most of the 2 days. He kept one arm around her back and she took his shoulder, and they moved to the clinic door without ceremony. He knocked twice and pushed it open. Dr. Morrison was at his desk, writing, and looked up with the calibrated alertness of a man who'd spent decades conditioning himself to shift from administrative work to medicine in the space of a second. He was a compact man in his 50s, gray-bearded, with quick eyes that moved over Hetty and went professional immediately. "Bring her here," he said, already standing. They got her to the examination table. Sarah Morrison appeared from the back room as if she'd heard something that hadn't made an audible sound and was already bringing a lamp and hot water without having been asked, which was Sarah's particular genius. She anticipated the next necessary thing before anyone else had named it. Morrison went to the foot first. He unwrapped it with care, took one look at it under the lamp, and then looked at F over his shoulder. The look was professional and specific, and it told F something he didn't want to know. "How long has the toenail bed been that color?" Morrison said. "Since I found her," F said. "Roughly 12 hours." Morrison looked back at the foot. He probed it carefully with his fingers, and F watched Hetty's face. She was watching Morrison's face, not the foot, reading him the way someone reads a document they know contains important information and are determined to understand fully. "Doctor," she said, "please be direct with me." Morrison looked at her. He had the good instinct to read immediately that she meant it. "The crushing injury to the right foot is severe," he said. "2 metatarsals fractured, possibly 3. The frostbite to the tissue of the ball and the 2 smaller toes has been prolonged and the damage is significant." He paused. "The gangrenous process has begun in the smaller toes. The discoloration and the temperature differential tell me the tissue is no longer viable." Silence in the room. Hetty's voice was even. "What does that mean in terms of treatment?" "It means that tissue that has died from frostbite and crushing injury cannot be restored, and dead tissue in an extremity becomes a source of systemic infection. If it isn't removed, the infection spreads." He held her gaze. "I need to perform a procedure. Soon. Tonight, if possible." Sarah Morrison had moved to Hetty's side and put her hand over Hetty's without making a thing of it. and Hetty's gaze went to Morrison and stayed there, steady and deliberate. "How extensive?" Hetty said. Morrison told her. The room was very quiet. F stood near the door with his hat in his hands and let the doctor speak and kept his eyes on Hetty's face. He watched her take in what Morrison was telling her, and he watched her absorb it. And he watched her make the particular decision that required a specific kind of courage. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind you could see from a distance, but the quiet interior kind that doesn't have an audience and doesn't need one. "All right," she said. "When tonight?" Morrison said. "The sooner the better. Then let's not delay it." Sarah Morrison squeezed her hand. Hetty looked at her, and something passed between them that was brief and private and real. F moved toward the table. "I'll be right outside," he said. Hetty looked at him. "You'll stay, as long as you need." "I don't need you to hold my hand," she said. She said it clearly, without apology. "But I want to know you're in the building." "I'll be in the building," he said. She nodded. Then she turned back to Morrison and said, "Tell me exactly what you're going to do, and in what order. I want to understand the procedure before it begins." Morrison blinked. Then he pulled a chair to the examination table and began explaining. And Hetty Vance, feverish and pale and badly hurt, and 2 days out of a Wyoming. Blizzard listened with her full attention and asked 3 precise clarifying questions. And F stood by the door and watched her, and thought that he had never in his life met anyone quite like her. Outside, the storm had dropped to a low murmur. Main Street was quiet. The lamp in Morrison's front window threw a rectangle of orange light into the snow, and F was still standing there, hat in hand, when the door behind him opened and he heard boots on the boardwalk and turned and saw, in the yellow lamplight spilling from the saloon across the street, the face of a man he'd seen before, only from a distance. Phineas Drake. Drake was a large man, well-dressed for the territory, with a silver watch chain visible at his vest, and the particular ease of movement that came from years of being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He had 2 men behind him, not the men from the timber, different ones. Beside him walked a smaller figure in a town marshal's badge, who was looking at his own boots. Drake saw F and smiled. It was the smile of a man who has positioned all the pieces he needs and is enjoying the moment before the conclusion. "Thorne," he said pleasantly, "I've been looking for you." Drake didn't move off the boardwalk right away. He stood there in the lamplight, with his hands easy at his sides and his smile in place, and let the moment arrange itself to his satisfaction. That was the thing about men like Drake. They understood the value of staging. They knew that power was partly theater, and they were patient about getting the lighting right. F didn't move either. The marshal, his name, was Aldous, F recalled. A man who'd come to Garnet Falls 2 years ago with decent enough references and had since developed a habit of being elsewhere when Drake's business got complicated, was looking at his boots the way a man looks at his boots when he's been asked to do something he'd rather not think about directly. One of Drake's men was holding a lantern. The other had his coat open in the cold, which meant he wanted his gun hand free and wasn't particular about who noticed. Cass had moved. F registered it in his peripheral vision. Cass stepping quietly off the boardwalk and angling toward the hitching post, putting himself at a different point in the geometry of the situation without making a production of it. Cass was good at that. He understood space and angle the way a blacksmith understood load and leverage. "You've had a rough couple of days from what I hear," Drake said. He came down the boardwalk steps without hurrying, rode out into that blizzard all alone. "Very heroic." A pause. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "I found the stagecoach," F said. "Terrible accident. That's one word for it." Drake stopped about 10 feet away. Up close, he was a man of around 50, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once and had since gone hard in the particular way that came from years of getting what he wanted by methods that didn't bear examination. His eyes were pale and attentive, and they moved over F with a professional assessment that was almost impersonal. "Marshal Aldous has some questions for you," Drake said, "about the stage driver." Aldous finally looked up from his boots. He had the expression of a man reading from a script he'd been handed 20 minutes ago and hadn't fully memorized. "Ephraim Thorne," he said, "I need you to come with me." "On what grounds?" Aldous reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch. It was the kind used to transport payroll flat, sealed with a brass clasp, with the Wyoming Territorial Stage Line stamp on the front. "This was found in your saddlebag," he said. "It's the driver's payroll pouch, missing since the crash." He didn't look at F while he said it. "Along with testimony from 2 witnesses that places you at the crash site before anyone else arrived." F looked at the pouch. He looked at it for a long, specific moment. Then he looked at Drake. Drake's smile hadn't moved. It was the smile of a man watching a chess piece fall over that he'd spent considerable time positioning. "That's not mine," F said. "The witnesses say otherwise." "What witnesses?" 2 men who were traveling the North Road last night. Drake supplied this smoothly, before Aldous could. "They saw you at the ravine, Thorne. Saw you going through the stage wreckage." A slight pause. "Purvis had a daughter in Laramie. It's a sad situation all around." F kept his face still. Inside, he was running calculations. Who was in that ravine, what the timeline looked like, what he could prove and what he couldn't prove yet. The 2 men from the timber, Hennessy and his partner. Witnesses now to a scene they'd helped create. It was clean work, as frames went. He had to give Drake that. He turned to Cass, just for a moment. Cass was looking at him from the hitching post with an expression that was controlled and alert, and asking a question without words. F answered it the same way, a slight movement of his chin toward the clinic door. Cass held his gaze for 1 second, then looked away. "I'll come with you, Marshal," F said. Aldous had the decency, or the guilt to look, briefly relieved that there wasn't going to be a scene. He gestured toward the far end of Main Street where the jailhouse sat between the feed store and the bank. Drake fell into step alongside F, which was presumptuous and deliberate. He kept his voice low and conversational, the kind of voice that didn't carry to the men around them. "I want you to think about this clearly," Drake said. "Highway robbery and murder in the Wyoming Territory. Federal charges. Potentially. A trial in Cheyenne that could take months. He let that sit for 3 steps. Or we have a conversation tonight. Just 2 businessmen finding a practical solution. A conversation about what? Water rights." Drake said it simply, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. "Your property line runs along Shoshone Creek for a 1/4 mile. That creek feeds 4 properties below yours in the valley. Sign over the usage rights to my holding company, and I can make the testimony against you disappear. Medical bills for your," a slight pause, "assessing. Your acquaintance paid in full. Everyone goes home." F walked 3 more steps without answering. "I'll think about it," he said. Drake smiled. "That's sensible." Inside Morrison's clinic, the lamp on the surgical table had been moved to maximize its light. Sarah Morrison had laid out instruments on a cloth beside the table, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had assisted her husband through procedures like this before more times than either of them would have chosen. She moved through the small space without wasted motion, heating water, preparing the chloroform cloth, setting out the suturing materials. Hetty was watching the instrument tray. She'd asked Morrison to explain the procedure, and he had, step by step, in the direct manner she'd requested. She understood what was going to happen. Understanding it didn't make it smaller, but it meant she could face it as a known thing rather than an unknown one, and that distinction mattered to her considerably. "The chloroform will work quickly," Morrison said. He was washing his hands at the basin, speaking over his shoulder. "You won't feel anything during the procedure itself. When you come around, afterward there will be pain, but we'll manage it." "How long will I be under?" "For this procedure, likely 40 minutes, perhaps less." She looked at the window. Outside, she could see the edge of the boardwalk and a strip of Main Street, and she'd seen F standing out there until Drake had appeared, and the marshal had come, and then they'd moved away down the street, and she'd lost the sight line. She'd registered all of it. She'd watched it from the examination table with a careful attention that she didn't let Morrison or Sarah see, because they had enough to manage, and there was nothing she could do about it from this table. What she could do was what was in front of her. Get through what needed to be done here, get functional, and then address the situation that was clearly developing outside. Sarah came to her side. She was a woman of about 45, brown-haired, with a steady quality about her that made the room feel calmer without her having to do anything overt to produce the effect. She looked at Hetty with a directness that was warm and measured at once. "Is there anything you need before we begin?" Sarah said. Hetty thought about it genuinely. "No," she said. "Let's proceed." Morrison came to the table. He looked at her with the careful attention of a physician who takes his patients seriously. "Miss Vance, I want to ask you something before we start, and I want you to answer it honestly." "I'll try. Are you afraid?" She met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "but fear and incapacity are different things." "I'm ready." Morrison nodded. He picked up the chloroform cloth. "Count backwards from 20, he said. She counted. She got to 14. Outside in the clinic's small yard, a horse shifted in the dark. Cass heard it from the boardwalk where he'd been standing since F walked away with Aldous. He went still and listened. The particular focused listening he'd developed over years of working with metal, where you learn to read a sound for its full information before reacting to it. A horse in the yard. Then a second sound. Boots on frozen ground, moving with deliberate care, coming around the side of the clinic, building away from the main street, where the lamplight didn't reach. Cass moved off the boardwalk and into the shadow beside the clinic door. The man came around the corner slowly. He was carrying something bundled under his coat. When he reached the clinic's side window and saw the light inside, the bright, concentrated light of a surgical lamp, he stopped and looked, and then began moving again, faster now, toward the back of the building. Cass stepped out of the shadow. "That's far enough," he said. The man stopped. He turned, and in the faint spill of light from the window he was visible, young, heavy-set, wearing a coat Cass didn't recognize from any of the valley's regular residents. A Drake man, then. One of the contingent that had come up from the southern operations 3 months ago. "Just passing through," the man said. Cass looked at the bundle under the man's coat. The end of it, visible below the coat's hem, was a thin metal tube with a wick. An incendiary, someone's plan B for the clinic. "You're going to set that down," Cass said, "and then you're going to walk back to wherever you came from, and you're going to tell whoever sent you that it didn't happen tonight." The man looked at Cass's crippled arm. He looked at the right hand, which was large and scarred from forge work, and he looked at the left arm, which hung wrong and couldn't grip. He did the math that people always did when they looked at Cass. He decided the math was in his favor. It wasn't. Cass had one good arm. He'd had one good arm since a casting accident at 17 had burned and damaged the nerves in the left beyond recovery. In the years since, he had developed his right arm into something that bore very little resemblance to what most people meant when they used the word strong. 20 years at a forge, every task requiring what 2 armed men divided between both sides instead concentrated into one. The grip was in a category by itself. The man reached for his belt. Cass closed the distance in 2 steps and hit him once, efficiently, with the right hand. The man went down with the incendiary bundle landing in the snow beside him. Cass picked it up and looked at it and walked it around to the front of the clinic, where he put it in the water trough with some feeling of satisfaction. He went back to the boardwalk. He stood there in the cold and watched Main Street and waited. The jailhouse smelled like coal smoke and damp wool. There were 2 cells, both empty before tonight, with iron-barred doors on heavy hinges and plank bunks along the walls. Aldous had lit the lamp on his desk and was doing his best to look official, which he was not managing well. Drake had not come in. He'd stopped at the door and said, "I'll expect your answer by morning, Thorne," and then left with his men, which meant he was confident the frame would hold without his presence and didn't feel the need to watch Aldous fumble through the booking. F sat on the plank bunk in the right cell and looked at the wall. He was not panicking. He'd been in worse positions, not legally but physically, in situations where the margin between his options was measured in seconds rather than hours. This had time in it, which meant it had room to maneuver. You found room, and then you moved. The problem was Hetty. She was in Morrison's clinic right now, with a bone saw and a chloroform cloth, and a procedure she'd faced with a steadiness that still struck him every time he thought about it. She'd face it without him in the building, because he was sitting in a jailhouse cell on a charge invented by the man who'd arranged the crash that had broken her foot to begin with. That was the thing he couldn't set down comfortably. Not the cell, not the frame, That. He thought about what she needed. She needed Morrison to do good work, which Morrison would. She needed to wake up in a place where someone she trusted was present, which Sarah Morrison was adequate for, until something better was arranged. She needed her affidavit materials. The sealed document from the territorial court clerk, which was in her bag, which was in the clinic, which was currently inaccessible to Drake, because Drake didn't know it existed. That was something. She needed Cass. F got up and went to the cell door and called for Aldous. The marshal came reluctantly from his desk. He stood on the other side of the bars, with the look of a man who'd made a choice he was living in the early stages of regretting. "I want to send a message to Cass Hayes," F said. "I can't. I'm not asking you to do anything that isn't standard practice for a man in custody, Aldous. A note to a friend. Write it yourself if you want to read it first." Aldous looked at him. "Drake's not going to." "Drake isn't the law here," Ebb said. "You are. That's worth remembering, before this goes much further in the direction it's heading." Aldous was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his face that was less comfortable than he wanted it to be. He went to his desk and came back with paper and a pencil. F wrote 4 words and passed it back through the bars. "Go to her. Stay." Aldous looked at it, apparently satisfied that it contained no legal complications, and went out. He came back 10 minutes later and said Hayes is at the clinic. Says he'll stay. F nodded and went back to the plank bunk. He didn't sleep. He sat with his back against the wall and thought through the evidence he had, the evidence he needed, and the question of how to close the distance between those two things from inside a jail cell. The axle. He'd seen it. He could describe the saw marks in precise detail, but a verbal description from a man who was currently charged with murdering the driver of that same stage wasn't going to carry weight in a territorial court. Someone needed to retrieve the physical piece before Drake's men got back to it. The harness. The cuts that matched Hetty's shears also still at the site. The sealed document from the territorial court clerk, which Hetty had been carrying since Cheyenne. He didn't know what was in it. It might be relevant, and it might not. But a nervous clerk who'd specifically asked for discretion in the delivery of a document to the county courthouse was interesting in context. Hetty had a legal mind. He'd seen it in her letters, and he'd confirmed it in the way she'd asked Morrison about the procedure precise, sequential, covering each variable before moving to the next. She would understand what they needed, and she would know how to use it. He just needed her to be on the other side of this surgery. That was the primary requirement for all subsequent plans. He looked at the small jailhouse window, which showed him a rectangle of black sky, and nothing else. The storm had quieted down to a murmur. Somewhere outside, Cass was in the clinic with a Hetty, and Morrison was working, and the night was moving through its hours. Hold on, he thought, though there was no one in the cell to hear it. Across the street and one building down, in the lit rectangle of Morrison's clinic, things had not gone smoothly. The procedure itself had. Morrison was skilled, and Hetty's body was strong despite what it had been through. And the work had taken 38 minutes and been accomplished with the efficiency of a physician who knew what he was doing and did it without drama. It was the waking up that was hard. She came back from the chloroform in stages, which was normal, but the pain arrived before her full consciousness did, and for a few minutes she was somewhere between the two, aware enough to feel what had happened, but not anchored enough to manage her response to it. Sarah had her hand and spoke to her quietly, and Cass was there somewhere at the edge of the room, not speaking, just present, which was what F had asked, and which turned out to be exactly right. When she surfaced fully, she lay still for a long moment and stared at the ceiling. Morrison was at the basin, cleaning instruments. He heard the change in her breathing and came to her side. "It went well," he said, "as well as this procedure goes." She didn't answer immediately. She was doing the specific work of being a person who has woken up to a permanent change and is deciding in real time how to be in relation to that change. It wasn't fast work. It wasn't supposed to be. F, she said finally. Sarah's expression shifted. She glanced at Cass and then back at Hetty. "There was a situation," she said carefully. "He's been detained, temporarily. Cass is here." Hetty turned her head. She looked at Cass across the room and Cass looked back at her with the particular directness of someone who isn't going to soften what he knows she can handle. "Drake," she said. "It wasn't a question, Drake," Cass confirmed. She looked at the ceiling again. She was quiet for long enough that Sarah put more blankets over her, and Morrison checked her pulse, and the lamp burned steadily, and the knights sat outside the window doing what knights in Wyoming did, which was take their time. "My bag," she said. "Right here." Cass brought it to her. She reached in and found the sealed document. She looked at it, turning it over in her hands. She looked at the seal, still intact. "Cass," she said, "I need you to do something for me. Tomorrow, when there's enough light to travel the road safely. Can you ride?" "Better than most," he said. "I need you to go back to the crash site, to the ravine." She described what F had told her about the axle, the saw marks, the location, what he'd said it looked like. "I need the axle piece, the section with the cut marks. I need it brought here." Cass nodded slowly. "That's a day's ride in the current conditions." "I know. Can you do it?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, and the harness, whatever's left of it." She held up the sealed document. "This needs to go to the courthouse, not Aldous. The clerk's office directly. I need a receipt for the delivery." She paused. "Don't let Drake's people intercept it. Don't discuss what it is with anyone who isn't you or me or F. Understood?" He took the document carefully, tucking it inside his coat. "One more thing." She looked at him steadily. "I need paper and a pen. Tonight, if Morrison has some to spare." "What for?" Cass said. "I'm going to write an affidavit," she said, "while everything is clear in my memory. The crash, the axle, the men who came to the cabin, everything F told me about the saw marks." She shifted slightly on the table and kept her voice even despite what that movement cost her. A witnessed account from a direct survivor of the incident, written the same night, dated and signed. She looked at Morrison. "Would you witness it, Doctor?" Morrison had been listening from the basin. He looked at this woman less than 2 hours out of surgery, lying on his examination table in the aftermath of significant physical trauma. And he said, after a moment, "I'll get you the paper." "Thank you." Sarah was looking at Hetty with an expression that was beyond admiration and had moved into something more like awe, which she was managing with the restraint of a woman who understood that the other person in the room didn't particularly want to be looked at that way and would find it more useful to just have the pen. Sarah went and got the pen. Down the street, in the jailhouse, F heard it. Faint, very faint, through the log walls and the distance and the lingering noise of the wind, but unmistakable. A sound from the direction of Morrison's clinic that lasted maybe 3 seconds, and then was absorbed by the night. He sat very still on the plank bunk. It was the sound of someone in pain at the boundary of what they could manage silently, and it was over quickly. And then the night went quiet again. He put his head back against the wall and closed his eyes and kept them closed for a long time. "She's alive," he thought. "That's the only thing that matters right now." Outside the jailhouse window, the snow had stopped. The sky had the particular clarity that came after a major storm system passed dense, black and cold, the stars hard and white and remote. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees in the last hour, which meant tomorrow would be brutal but clear. Clear was what they needed. Clear meant travel. Clear meant Cass could ride. He turned his mind back to the problem in front of him, because thinking about Hetty in that clinic was not something he could afford to do at length right now. He needed to be useful. Sitting in this cell was not useful, so the question was how to leave it, or how to make the time in it work towards something. Drake would come in the morning. That was the structure of the offer he'd made. Your answer by morning. And Drake was the kind of man who arrived on schedule to reinforce the impression of control. He'd come with the same calm certainty he'd had on the boardwalk, and he'd expect to find Eve tired and isolated and calculating the cost of resistance, which was what a night in a jail cell was designed to produce. Eve thought about what he was going to say. The conversation would be short. Drake would present the terms again, with perhaps more specificity about the consequences of refusal. He'd talk about the murder charge, the Cheyenne court, the months of a trial. He might mention Hetty her medical bills, her situation, her vulnerability in a territory where she had no established connections and no income. He'd use everything he had. F had run through the calculation Drake wanted him to run. He'd run it carefully and honestly, looking at it from every angle, the way you look at a contract before you sign it. And the answer came out the same every time. The water rights for Shoshone Creek didn't just affect his ranch. They affected every property downstream. 4 families. The Hayes place where Cass ran his smithy, the Morrison homestead, a half-mile from the clinic. 2 other ranching families who'd been in the valley longer than Drake had been in the territory. If F signed those rights over, Drake would have leverage over all of them. The ability to restrict water flow, to charge rates that made operations non-viable, to squeeze until people sold and moved on. That was what Drake was buying. 1 parcel at a time, the whole valley. F was not going to be the mechanism for that. He heard the jailhouse door open. He heard Aldous moving around at his desk, building the coal stove up against the cold. He heard the small sounds of a man doing the ordinary things that ordinary nights required, trying very hard to feel ordinary about a night that wasn't. Around 2 in the morning, F lay down on the plank bunk and put his arm over his eyes. He wasn't going to sleep, but horizontal was better than upright for conserving warmth, and he needed to be clear-headed when Drake came. He thought about Hetty's voice in the cabin. I want to know you're in the building. He hadn't been in the building. He'd make that right. There was time. There would be time, if they were careful and smart and worked the problem from both sides of the wall Drake had put between them. Trust isn't something you give when the sun is shining and take back the moment a storm rolls in. He'd said that to Cass. What felt like a long time ago, but was only yesterday. He believed it. He'd always believed it. It was the thing he'd come back to in the army when the orders made no sense, and in the years after when the ranch was failing, and in the months when the idea of trying, again trying at any of it, the ranch, the partnership, the particular kind of hope that a stack of clove-scented letters could produce in a man who'd stopped expecting that kind of thing, felt like more risk than he could justify. He'd been wrong about the risk. He was usually wrong about the risk. He lay on the plank bunk and stared at the ceiling and waited for morning. Dawn came cold and clear, exactly as the overnight temperature had promised. Eve heard boots on the boardwalk before he saw anything. Then the jailhouse door opened, and Drake came in, alone this time, without the theater of the previous night. Just a man in a good coat, rested, carrying a cup of coffee he'd gotten from the hotel kitchen across the street, and wearing the expression of someone who has concluded the negotiation in his own mind and is here to sign the papers. He sat in Aldis's chair. Aldis had absented himself, which meant Drake had arranged it, which meant Drake had some degree of leverage over Aldis that F added to his mental ledger. Drake looked at F through the cell bars. You had the night to think, Drake said. I did, F said. And F looked at him across the space between the plank bunk and the cell door. He'd had the night to think. That was true. He'd thought about the charge and the evidence and the witnesses and the water rights and all the pieces Drake had moved into place with the patience of a man who'd done this kind of thing before in other valleys with other ranchers. He'd thought about Hetty on Morrison's surgical table. He'd thought about Purvis, who had a daughter in Laramie and who had been killed by a saw cut in an axle that Drake had ordered. He'd thought about what it meant to live and die by your word in a territory where the law could be rented by the hour. He leaned forward on the bunk and put his forearms on his knees and looked Drake in the eye. Then he said something that was not the answer Drake had paid for a night in a jail cell to produce. Drake's expression didn't change immediately. It took a moment, the way it takes a moment for the body to register a blow before the pain arrives. Then the smile went away, not dramatically, just quietly, like a lamp that's been turned down. You understand what this means, Drake said. Yes, F said. I understand exactly what it means. Drake stood up. He set the coffee cup on Aldis's desk, smoothed his coat, and moved to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back once. There's a bone saw in Morrison's clinic, he said. Your woman already knows what it costs to be in this valley without the right protection. His voice was very even. Think about what the next cost looks like. F held his gaze and did not answer, because answering would have required doing something that the bars between them currently prevented, and he was thinking about tomorrow, not tonight. Drake went out. Outside Morrison's clinic, the morning light hit the snow and turned it white and brilliant and blinding. Inside, on the examination table, Hetty Vance was writing. Her handwriting was precise and clear and steady, moving across the page in even lines that named dates and locations and observations and factual descriptions of saw marks and harness cuts, and a coach driver named Purvis who had a daughter in Laramie. She wrote 3 pages without stopping. Morrison witnessed each page, signed dated, the clinic's address noted below his signature. The lamp burned on the table. Sarah brought tea that Hetty drank without looking up from the paper. The morning was cold and clear, and the kind of still that comes after a storm has said everything it had to say. Down the street, iron handcuffs were cold and solid around F's wrists. Up the street, a pen moved across paper in a hand that didn't shake. The day was just beginning. The cell was 8 feet by 10 feet and contained a plank bunk, a bucket, and approximately nothing else. Eve had measured it by pacing on his first morning. He'd paced it again on his second morning, not because he'd forgotten the dimensions, but because moving was better than sitting still. When sitting still meant thinking about things he couldn't affect from inside 8 feet by 10 feet. Drake came on the second day. Mid-morning, after Aldous had brought the breakfast that F mostly left alone. Drake came in without his men this time, just himself and his coat and his watch chain, and he sat in the chair on the other side of the bars with the ease of a man paying a social call. He looked different from the night on the boardwalk. The theater of that encounter, the staging, the timing, the careful arrangement of witnesses was gone. What remained was more interesting, in the way that a stripped-down engine is more interesting than the vehicle built around it. You could see the working parts. "You've had another night," Drake said. F looked at him from the bunk and said nothing. "I'm going to interpret silence as continued consideration rather than refusal," Drake said. "Because refusal at this point would be a serious error in judgment, and I don't take you for a man who makes those." "I make them occasionally," F said. "The charges against you are federal in scope. The territorial court in Cheyenne handles cases of this category. A man can sit in a cell for months waiting for a hearing date." Drake's voice remained conversational. "I've seen it happen. Good men. Reasonable men who simply waited too long to make the practical decision. A pause. Your ranch sits empty. Your horses need tending, and the woman you brought in from the blizzard is recovering from a significant surgery with no means of support and no legal standing in this territory as your wife or kin." F kept his eyes on Drake and kept his face still. "The water rights," Drake said. "One signature, Shoshone Creek usage transferred to Consolidated Valley Holdings. The charges against you are withdrawn this afternoon. I have the authority to make that happen, and I'm prepared to do so." He leaned forward slightly. "Additionally, and I want you to hear this clearly, I will personally cover Miss Vance's medical bills, Morrison's fees, the recovery period, whatever she requires. You walk out of here today. She has what she needs." The jailhouse was quiet except for the coal stove ticking in the corner. "And Purvis," F said. Drake tilted his head slightly. "The driver," F said. "The man who died because someone sawed through his axle. He had a daughter in Laramie. What does she get in your arrangement?" Something moved behind Drake's pale eyes. He controlled it quickly. "Accidents happen on these roads. The winter conditions, the saw marks on that axle aren't a weather condition," F said. "And you know that. And I know that. And eventually other people are going to know that too." He looked at Drake steadily. "I'm not signing anything. Not the water rights. Not a confession. Not a bill of sale. Nothing." Drake was quiet for a long moment. "You understand what this means," he said. "You said that already. I'm saying it again because I'd like you to be clear." Drake stood, smoothing his coat with both hands. "The witnesses are prepared to testify. The physical evidence places you at the scene. The territorial court will hear the case in spring, which means you sit here until April at the earliest." He picked up his hat from the desk. "I'm offering you a door, Thorne. It's still open. Close it on your way out," F said. Drake looked at him for one more moment. Then he put his hat on and left, and the door closed with a sound that was solid and final, and that F sat with for the rest of the morning. He spat on the floor in the direction Drake had been sitting. Then he put his back against the wall and started thinking about what Hetty was doing. What Hetty was doing was learning to stand. It was the fourth day since the surgery. Morrison had been clear about the recovery timeline. He was a direct man who believed in giving his patients accurate information rather than comfortable estimates, which was one of the reasons Hetty respected him. The surgical site needed time. The body needed to adjust to a change in weight distribution and balance. Crutches would be her primary means of mobility for weeks, possibly months, and she would need to build upper body strength to use them effectively over distance. He'd said all of this on the morning of the third day, sitting at the foot of the examination table with his hands folded and his tone precise. She had listened to every word. Then she had asked him to bring the crutches. He'd brought them. They were standard Frontier, crutches rudely made, wooden, sized for someone taller than she was, and she'd looked at them and then looked at Sarah, who'd been watching from the doorway. "I need them shorter," she said. "I can adjust the padding," Morrison said. "The uprights need to be shortened. 1.5 inches, maybe 2. If they're too tall, I'll be working against the angle, and I'll tire twice as fast." She ran her hand along the wood, measuring by feel and sight. "Do you have a saw?" Morrison had the saw. He and Cass, who'd come in from his first ride to the crash site, still cold and stiff and trailing snow from his coat, had made the adjustments while she directed. The result was better, though not right, and she'd spent the rest of that day working out the remaining corrections by you standing, falling, adjusting, standing again. Sarah had hovered. "I'm not going to break," Hetty had told her. "I know that," Sarah said. "I'm hovering because I find it useful to hover, not because I think you're fragile." Hetty had looked at her and then, unexpectedly, laughed. It was brief and slightly painful and entirely genuine. "All right," she said. "Hover." By the end of the third day, she could cross the length of the clinic and back without stopping. By the fourth day, she could manage the 3 steps up from Morrison's side door to the boardwalk and down again. The movement cost her. Everything cost her right now, and she was honest with herself about the nature of that cost. The physical expenditure of it, the way her arms shook after a long stretch on the crutches, the balance she was still developing on her modified left foot. She held that honesty without dramatizing it in either direction. What she couldn't do was stay in the clinic, not because the clinic was inadequate. Morrison and Sarah had been exceptional professional and kind and practically useful in equal measure, which was exactly what the situation required, and not everyone could manage. She was grateful for the clinic. She would be grateful for a long time. But F was in the jailhouse 3 buildings down the street, and he had been there for 4 days on a charge built out of planted evidence and paid witnesses. And the person who was going to do something about that was her. Cass had brought back the axle section on his second ride to the crash site. He'd come in on the evening of the 4th day, stamping snow from his boots at the clinic door, carrying a piece of iron that was about 18 inches long and still bore the saw marks exactly as F had described them. He'd wrapped it in oilcloth to protect the cut surfaces from additional weather damage during the ride, which was careful and sensible and made Hetty look at him with appreciation. "The harness," she said. "What was left of it?" "Yes." He reached into his pack and produced a section of cut leather, the traces and collar straps that Hetty herself had cut free with her shears. She looked at her own work, the clean, sustained cut of a bookbinder's shears through heavy harness leather, and then looked at the manufactured cuts on the remaining traces. The ones Drake's men had made, which were different, slightly ragged, made with a belt knife rather than a specialized tool. The difference was visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. "I need to write something," she said. She'd already written the initial affidavit, witnessed by Morrison, on the night of the surgery. That document detailed her personal account of the crash, her survival actions, and EF's description of the axle. What she needed now was something more specific, a technical description of the physical evidence, written in language that would function in a legal document. She spent 2 hours on it. She sat at Morrison's desk with the axle piece and the harness sections on the cloth beside her, and wrote a detailed technical description of each item, the saw marks on the axle, the depth and angle and spacing that indicated deliberate mechanical action rather than stress fracture, the contrast between the shear-cut leather and the knife-cut leather on the harness traces. She was not a lawyer. She knew that. But she had grown up in a household where legal documents were discussed at the supper table, where her father's abolitionist work had required an understanding of how written language functioned in courts, what made a document admissible versus inadmissible, how to describe physical evidence in terms that were specific enough to be useful and precise enough to be defensible. She wrote with that knowledge. She wrote as a witness and as a person with documented craft expertise in the tools whose marks were present on the evidence. A bookbinder's shears, leaving a particular cut profile that she could describe with professional authority. Morrison witnessed this document as well. Then she asked Cass to stay while she drafted the petition. The sealed document from the territorial court clerk in Cheyenne had been delivered to the courthouse clerk's office the morning after the surgery, exactly as she'd asked. Cass had gotten the receipt. The document itself was now in official hands, which meant Drake couldn't touch it, and whatever it contained was on its way into the administrative system. She didn't know what was in it. She didn't need to know yet. What she was drafting now was a petition addressed directly to the Wyoming Territorial Circuit Court. Not to Aldous, not to any local official who might fall within Drake's operational radius, but to the circuit court that operated above the county level and was not subject to local political pressure in the same way. She wrote clearly and without rhetorical excess. She stated the facts in sequence. She attached the affidavit and the technical description as supporting documents. She named Phineas Drake. She named the marshal. She named the specific charge against F. and the specific grounds on which she believed that charge to be fraudulent. She named the witnesses Drake had identified as the basis for the charge and noted that 2 of them matched the description of men who had attempted to assault her, and F at the line cabin, which made their testimony a matter of some interest in the question of Drake's involvement in the original sabotage. At the bottom of the petition, she wrote, "I am prepared to testify to all of the above under oath before the Territorial Circuit Court, and to present the physical evidence in my possession at any time and location the court designates." She signed it, dated it. Morrison witnessed it. Cass looked at the completed documents spread across the desk. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at Hetty. "Where does this go?" he said. "The Territorial Circuit Judge is due in Garnet Falls in 6 days for the regular quarterly session," she said. "These documents go to his clerk on his arrival, before Drake has any opportunity to interfere with that process." She looked at Cass. "Can you make sure they get there without going through Aldous or anyone connected to Drake?" "I know a man," Cass said. "Retired deputy from Laramie. Lives 2 miles out of town. He's got no business with Drake and no reason to help him." "That's enough," she said. On the 5th day, she went outside. It was cold, genuinely cold, the post-storm cold that sat over the territory like a weight and made the air hurt slightly to breathe. And the street was quiet in the mid-morning way that frontier towns were quiet. The serious business of the day already underway, and the social business not yet started. She came out, Morrison's front door on the crutches, got her balance on the boardwalk, and stood there for a moment in the cold air. The light was sharp and white off the snow. After 5 days of the clinic's dim interior, it was almost too much, and she let her eyes adjust before she moved. She had a particular destination. The jailhouse was 3 buildings down the street. She knew F could see the street from the small window in his cell. She didn't know if he'd see her, but she was going in that direction regardless, because she had business on the street, and the route to that business happened to pass in front of the jailhouse window. She was halfway there when she became aware of the audience. It had accumulated the way audiences in small towns do, not all at once, not without any announcement. Just a gradual accretion of people who were going about their business but happened to be going about it in the same general direction as something interesting. 4 women outside the general store, 2 men leaning on the post in front of the saloon, which wasn't open yet but provided a convenient leaning surface, the hotel proprietor in his doorway, the feed store owner, and his boy. She kept walking. She heard it at the edge of audibility. A woman's voice near the general store, not directed at Hetty, but not lowered much either. Terrible business, losing a foot, poor thing. And then another voice, a man's. Should have stayed in Philadelphia if she couldn't handle frontier life. And then a third. Thorne should have known better than to. She stopped. It wasn't planned. She stopped walking, and she turned, and she looked at the group of people on the boardwalk, and something that had been sitting quietly in her for 5 days through. The surgery, and the recovery, and the documents, and the evidence, and the cell that held F on a manufactured charge, while the man who'd manufactured it drank coffee in the hotel came up through her like water finding its level. She pitched her voice to Carrie. "I'd like to say something," she said. The street went quiet in the particular way that streets go quiet when something unexpected is happening that no one wants to miss. She turned toward the jailhouse as she spoke. She knew the window. She'd marked it from the moment she came out the clinic door. A man is sitting in that jail cell on charges invented by a man who killed a stage driver and broke my foot and has been systematically stealing water rights from every family in this valley. She looked at the faces on the boardwalk. He is sitting there because he refused to let injustice be purchased at his expense. He is sitting there because he has more integrity than everyone who put him there put together. No one spoke. She gave them a moment, then continued. "I have heard a number of things said about me since I arrived in this territory. That I'm a burden, that I should have stayed where I came from. That what happened to my foot is a consequence of not belonging here." She looked steadily at the faces, not with anger, but with a directedness that was harder to look away from than anger would have been. "I want to address that directly." She lifted one crutch slightly and set it back down. "A physical impairment does not equate to a moral flaw," she said. "I am not less capable of thought because I am less capable of walking. I am not less deserving of justice because I arrived here on a stagecoach that a wealthy man had sabotaged. And the law," she paused, letting the word sit for a moment, "the law exists to protect human dignity, not to serve as an instrument for wealthy tyrants to crush the innocent." The street was very quiet. A horse at the hitching post shifted its weight. Someone in the crowd coughed and then seemed to regret it. She looked at the faces around her. The women near the general store, the men by the saloon, the proprietors in their doorways. These were not bad people, most of them. She'd lived enough life to understand the difference between people who were cruel and people who were frightened and chose cruelty's convenience. These people were frightened. Drake had been in this valley long enough and had enough demonstrated willingness to act that being frightened of him was a rational position. But frightened people making bad choices still made bad choices. She wasn't going to pretend that was acceptable just because the alternative was uncomfortable. "The Territorial Circuit Court convenes here in 6 days, she said. "There is physical evidence of the crime that put that man in that cell and killed the driver of the stage I was traveling on. That evidence is in official hands. The court will hear it." She looked from face to face. "I'm telling you this not to frighten you, but because you deserve to know what is actually happening in your town. And because some of you know things about Phineas Drake's operations that a court would be very interested in hearing." She let that stand. Let people think about what they knew and hadn't said. Then she turned and continued down the boardwalk toward the courthouse clerk's office, where she had an appointment. She didn't look at the jailhouse window. She knew F was there. She didn't need to look. Behind her, the street remained quiet for a moment. Then she heard something low, not dramatic. Just 2 or 3 people beginning to move and talk in a different register than they'd been using before, the register of people who are reconsidering something. It was small, but small things were where most things started. Inside the jailhouse, F had been at the window. He'd seen her come out of Morrison's door, had watched her get her balance on the boardwalk and take the measure of the street, had watched her stop in the middle of that street and turn and say something to the people on the boardwalk that he couldn't hear through the log wall and the glass, but that he could read from the stillness it produced, the way a stone produces stillness in water when you drop it in. He watched her walk away down the boardwalk on her crutches, upright and steady and deliberate, and he leaned his forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window. Aldous came to the cell door an hour later. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that was working through several stages of something complicated. "That woman," he said. He didn't clarify which woman, as there was only one relevant woman in the conversation. F turned from the window. "Yes, she spoke to half the town this morning." Aldous paused. "I heard about it from 4 different people inside of an hour." F waited. "She's petitioned the circuit court," Aldous said. "Judge Hartwell's due in 6 days. I got a message from the territorial clerk's office this afternoon that Hartwell's been alerted to a complaint in this jurisdiction and will be reviewing the case file on arrival." He stopped. That's above my authority, Thorne. Once Hartwell's involved, I can't. Drake can't. It's a different situation." F looked at the marshal for a long moment. She did that herself. Her and the blacksmith. Hayes delivered the documents. Aldous took his hands out of his pockets. He was a man who'd made a bad choice and was now standing in the space where bad choices eventually put you, which was somewhere uncomfortable that you had to decide what to do about. "I want you to know something." "All right." "I don't—" He stopped. Tried again. "Drake came to me 3 months ago. He had information about something in my past. In Ohio, he made it clear what cooperation was expected." He looked at the floor. "That's not an excuse. I know that's not an excuse. I'm telling you because—" He stopped again. "Because you're deciding what to do now," F said. Aldous looked up. Yes, F considered him. A frightened man who had made the wrong choice under pressure and was now being offered an opportunity to make a different one. There was a version of F. Thorne, the version forged in the Army, the version that had learned to divide people into assets and liabilities in the field, that would have used that fear efficiently and without sentiment. But that was a younger version, and he'd left most of him in Virginia. "Tell Hartwell what you told me," F said, "about Drake's approach, about what he had on you. Tell him plainly." A pause. "A man who comes forward isn't the same as a man who has to be dragged forward. Hartwell will know the difference." Aldous was quiet. Then he reached into his pocket and produced a key. He put it in the cell door lock. "Hartwell's 6 days out," he said. "You need to be available to testify when he arrives. You don't leave the county." He turned the key. "And Thorne, keep those horses fed. It's going to be a cold spring." The door swung open. FF stepped out of the cell. He picked up his coat and his hat from the hook on the wall where Aldous had put them on the first night. He checked that his revolver and the Winchester were in the marshal's cabinet and confirmed Aldous would hold them until after Hartwell's session. Then he walked out of the jailhouse into the cold, clear air of Garnet Falls Main Street and stood there for a moment with his eyes adjusting to the light. He looked toward Morrison's clinic. Hetty was on the boardwalk outside the courthouse clerk's office, 2 buildings up. She was finishing a conversation with the clerk, papers in hand, and as F watched, she folded the receipt carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Then she turned to go and saw him standing in the street. They looked at each other across the distance. He crossed the street. She waited where she was, watching him come. When he reached the boardwalk below where she was standing, he stopped and looked up at her. She looked back down at him. She was on the crutches, standing straight, with her dark hair pinned back and her coat around her, and the receipt in her pocket, and 5 days of very hard work in her eyes. "You heard what I said to the street," she said. "I saw it. Couldn't hear it from the cell. Probably for the best." A pause. It was slightly more impassioned than I generally prefer to be in public. "What did you say?" she told him. She gave it to him plainly, and in sequence, the way she gave him everything. No embellishment, no performance. Just the facts of what she'd said and why she'd said it. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The petition," he said, "filed with the territorial clerk's office. Hartwell will have the case file before he arrives." She looked at him with eyes that were tired and steady in equal measure. "The physical evidence is documented and in official hands. The affidavits are witnessed. The sealed document from the Cheyenne clerk is in the system. What was in it? I found out this morning." She looked at him. "It was a complaint filed by 3 Valley homesteaders with the Territorial Land Office 8 months ago. Documented instances of Drake's men interfering with water flow on Shoshone Creek. The clerk in Cheyenne was afraid to process it through local channels because he believed Drake had influence there." She paused. He was right to be afraid. but the document is in official channels now, and it corroborates the pattern. F looked at her. He looked at this woman still recovering from surgery, still building her balance on crutches, still running a fever that came and went according to its own schedule, still in the first week of what was going to be a long road standing on a boardwalk in Wyoming, telling him she'd dismantled Drake's legal maneuver from a clinic examination table and a courthouse clerk's office. Cass brought back the axle, he said. Yes, and the harness. I wrote technical descriptions of both. Morrison witnessed them. The witnesses Drake paid. Their testimony becomes considerably less useful when the physical evidence contradicts it, and when they themselves match the description in my affidavit of men who committed assault at the Line cabin. She looked at him directly. They're problems, but manageable problems. He nodded slowly. He put one hand on the boardwalk post next to where she was standing and looked at her for a long moment. You did all of this in 5 days, he said, from a clinic table. 4.5 days, she said. The first half day was the surgery. He almost smiled. 4.5 days. I had help, she said it honestly. Cass. Morrison. Sarah. A pause. And you had already done the foundational work. The axle, the harness, the observation at the crash site. I built from what you'd given me. Hetty. That's accurate, F. I'm not being modest. I'm being precise, he said. I know. She looked at him. Her chin was up, and her eyes were clear. And underneath the fatigue, and the pain, and the precise, measured way she handled everything there, was something that had been there from the beginning, that he'd first seen in the cabin when she'd said, "Don't abandon me," and then had gathered back up and put away, and spent the 5 days since using to do what needed doing. She was extraordinary. He had thought about how to say that and decided it would take more time than was available on a boardwalk in a small town on a cold morning, and that she wouldn't want him to be poetic about it. Anyway, she would want him to be useful. She would want him to help. What do you need? He said. Right now. Today, she considered. I need someone to look at the crutches. The left one is slightly longer than the right, and it's affecting my gait. Cass adjusted them, but I think we need one more refinement. All right. And I want to go back to the clinic and sleep for approximately 12 hours. Also all right, and she paused. I want to know the horses are taken care of. Your horses. I've been thinking about the bay mare. He looked at her. Thinking about her how? You said she was particular about who handled her. She's been alone in the barn for nearly a week. I imagine she's expressing opinions about that. She said it with the same directness she brought to everything. But underneath it was something warmer. Something that was asking about his life, without asking about his life. Are they all right? Cass has been out to feed. They're all right. He looked at her. I'll go out tomorrow. Good. She shifted her weight slightly on the crutches. The cold was getting to her, and he could see it in the way she was conserving motion. Let's get you back inside, he said. She didn't argue, which was how he knew the cold and the exertion had reached their limit. She turned, and he walked beside her back toward the clinic, matching her pace without comment, not taking her arm or offering to carry anything, just walking next to her, present and steady. At the clinic door, she stopped and looked at him. 6 days, she said, until Hartwell. We're not finished, she said, with Drake. No, he'll do something before the court session. He won't just wait. Probably not. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the street. Then she looked back at him. Then we should be ready for it. Yes, he said. We should. She went inside. He held the door and let it close behind her, and stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the cold air, looking at the street where she had stood and spoken to the town of Garnet Falls, and made them listen. Down at the far end of Main Street, outside the hotel, where Drake kept his offices, 2 men in heavy coats were watching F from a distance. He looked at them until they looked away. 6 days. He had 6 days, and he had Hetty, and he had Cass, and he had 3 pages of witnessed affidavit, and a piece of sawed iron in official custody, and a sealed complaint from 3 Valley homesteaders working its way through the territorial system. Drake had money and influence and fear. Those were real tools. He'd used them effectively for years, but fear only worked until the people it was applied to had something to be more afraid of than the man applying it. And the women and men of Garnet Falls had just stood on a street and heard a woman on crutches tell them, plainly and without drama, that the law existed to protect them. Some of them had believed her. That was enough to start with. F turned up his collar and started walking toward the livery stable, where Samson needed attention, and the thinking that hard situations required was always better done while working with horses than while standing in the cold. The 6 days were already running. Judge Hartwell arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days ahead of schedule, which no one had anticipated, and which suited Hetty's purposes considerably better than the original timeline. He was a compact, gray-haired man from Cheyenne, with a reputation for impatience with procedural theatrics and a demonstrated preference for evidence over testimony. He'd been a circuit judge for 16 years. He'd seen every variety of frontier legal manipulation, and according to the retired deputy who'd helped Cass deliver the documents, Hartwell's response to the sealed complaint from the Valley homesteaders had been a single word that the clerk had declined to repeat in mixed company. The hearing lasted 2 days. Hetty testified on the first day, seated at the table because standing for extended periods was still beyond her for another week. She gave her account in precise sequential order, the way she'd written it: the crash, the harness, the cabin, the men who came to the cabin, the axle, and then the 5 days of evidence documentation from Morrison's examination table. She answered every question directly and without elaboration beyond what the question required, which was a skill most witnesses never mastered. Hartwell listened without interrupting, which was his own form of response. The sawed axle section sat on the table in front of the court in its oilcloth wrapping, and when Hartwell's appointed examiner, a civil engineer who'd been traveling with the judge's party, described the cut marks in technical language that corroborated everything F had observed at the crash site, Drake's attorney went very quiet. Eve testified on the second morning. He was brief and specific and left no gaps that a cross-examination could insert doubt into, because there was no doubt to insert. What had happened, and the physical evidence agreed with his account in every particular. Aldous testified in the afternoon. He sat in the chair with his hands folded on the table and told Hartwell about Drake's approach. 3 months ago, about the information Drake had used as leverage, about the night Drake had come to him with the payroll pouch and the 2 witnesses he'd produced. He told it plainly, without excusing himself, and when Hartwell asked him why he was coming forward now, he said, simply, that someone had reminded him what the law was actually for. Hartwell looked at him for a long moment. Then he wrote something on the paper in front of him and moved to the next question. Drake was arrested on the second afternoon with evidence that Hartwell described in his ruling as overwhelming in scope and clarity. The ruling also addressed the corrupt marshal and outlined the specific charges that would be proceeding to the federal court in Cheyenne. Consolidated Valley Holdings' claim on the water rights was suspended pending investigation of the underlying acquisition methods, which meant Shoshone Creek ran free through the valley for the first time in 2 years. F heard the ruling from the back of the makeshift courtroom, which was the hotel's dining room. Cleared of tables, he heard it all the way through, standing with his arms folded and his hat in his hands. When Hartwell finished reading, he put his hat back on and walked out without talking to anyone. He stood on the street for a moment. Then he went to find Hetty. She was at Morrison's, finishing a letter. She'd written several over the past 2 days to the homesteaders downstream on Shoshone Creek, explaining what the ruling meant for their water access, and to the Territorial Land Office, documenting the outcome for the official record. She looked up when F came in and read the answer in his face before he said anything. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She looked at the letter in her hands. She set it down on the desk with care, aligning it with the edge, which was the kind of precise, unconscious gesture she made when she was absorbing something that required a moment to absorb. "All of it," she said. "All of it. Drake's in custody. The water rights suspension is official." She was quiet. Then she said, "Purvis's daughter." Hartwell noted it in the ruling. "The federal case will address it." He sat down across from her. "It won't bring him back." "No," she looked at the window. "But it names what happened to him. That's not nothing." "No," he said, "it isn't." Sarah Morrison appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the good sense not to say anything. She set them on the desk and went back out. And F and Hetty sat with the coffee and the quiet and the particular feeling of a thing resolved that doesn't feel the way you expected it to feel, which is usually less triumphant and more simply tired. I want to go home, Hetty said. He looked at her. I know it isn't technically. She stopped. I know the arrangements are still. You're going home, he said. That's settled. She looked at him with an expression that held several things at once and resolved into something simple. All right, she said. Getting Hetty to the broken spear required logistics that F worked through with Cass the evening before the move. The main practical question was the wagon versus the horse. The wagon was more stable and would jar her less on the road, but the road after the storm was still rough in places and slow going. Samson, with Hetty riding and F walking alongside, was faster, but demanded more from her physically. Hetty settled the discussion by pointing out that she'd ridden a draft horse bareback through a blizzard and could certainly manage Samson on a clear road with a proper saddle. Cass looked at F. F looked at Cass. The wagon question was retired. They made the ride in an hour and a half on a cold, bright morning, Hetty in the saddle and F on the bay mare beside her, with Cass driving a supply wagon behind them that held Hetty's repacked satchel, Morrison's instructions for the ongoing wound care, and a considerable quantity of food that Sarah had organized without being asked. Hetty was quiet for most of the ride. She looked at the country around her. The snow-covered valley, the mountain line to the west, the creek threading silver through the white floor of the valley, with the sustained attention of someone seeing a thing for the first time and wanting to hold it accurately. The creek, she said, when they reached the point where the road ran alongside Shoshone Creek for a quarter mile before it turned toward the ranch. That's it, F said. She looked at it, just looked for a long moment. Then she said, it's beautiful. In summer, it's something else. Tell me. He told her about the creek in summer. The sound it made over the rocks near the bend, the way it ran cold from the snowmelt all the way through July, the fish that came up in the lower pools in the evening. He told her about the meadow beyond it, where the mares grazed, and the way the light came down the mountain in the late afternoon and turned everything that particular gold that didn't exist anywhere else he'd ever been. She listened to all of it, and he was aware that this was a new thing. Talking about the ranch this way, describing it to someone who was receiving the description with real attention. He'd lived here 11 years, and Clara had been here for 3 of them. But Clara had been born in the territory and grew up with all of it, and there was nothing to explain. Hetty was seeing it fresh, and explaining it to her was like looking at it fresh himself. When the broken spear came into view around the last bend, the main house, the barn behind it, the fence lines running out into the snowy meadow. He watched her face. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, straight on, without pretense, taking it in full. It's a good house, she said. The barn needs work in the spring. The house is good, she said again. Definitive, like she'd made a decision about it. F had spent 4 days at the ranch between the court hearing and the day of the move. He'd told Hetty he was going out to tend the horses, which was true. He'd tended the horses every day, giving each animal proper attention after the disrupted week. The bay mare had expressed her opinions about the irregular schedule by being difficult for the first 20 minutes of each session and then settling down, which was consistent with her established personality. But the horses weren't the only thing he'd done. He'd started with the kitchen. The counter heights in a ranch house kitchen were built for a standing adult of average height, which meant they were built for him. They weren't built for someone who would be working from a seated position for weeks, or who would be managing tasks with crutches for months, or who, and he thought about this carefully and honestly, might have permanent changes to her mobility that needed to be accounted for in the permanent structure of the space. He lowered the main work counter by 4 inches. It took a full day. He had to recut the supports, reattach the surface, and make sure the result was solid enough to bear the weight of serious cooking work and the occasional additional load of a person steadying themselves against it. He tested it himself by putting his full weight on the edge in multiple positions before he was satisfied. The second day, he worked on the handrails. He put them along the main hallway wall pine, sanded smooth, mounted at a height that would be useful rather than decorative. Not every wall, the walls that mattered. The hallway from the bedroom to the kitchen, the interior wall beside the back door. He thought about each one before he put it in, considering the path between places and where support would make the difference between independent movement and needing to ask for help. He didn't want her to have to ask. That was the point of all of it. He was not building something for himself to feel useful. He was building something so she could move through her own home without requiring permission or assistance. The ramps took most of the third day. The front door had 2 steps. The back door had 3. He built smooth wooden ramps over both, sanded the surfaces, tested them with a loaded wheelbarrow to make sure they'd hold weight and wouldn't shift. The ramp angle was shallow enough to navigate with crutches, and later, if needed, with a wheelchair. Cass had helped with the back door ramp. He'd come out on the 3rd afternoon and looked at what F was doing and picked up a hammer without being asked. And they'd worked in the companionable near silence that characterized most of their joint projects. "She'll know what this is," Cass said at one point. "Yes," F said. "She's going to think something about it." "I know. What do you think she'll think?" F drove a nail home and reached for another. "I think she'll think it's practical, and then she'll think about why it's practical and what that means." He paused. "And then she'll get on with things." Cass considered this. "That sounds right," he said. On the 4th day, he moved the bedroom furniture. The original configuration had the bed against the far wall, which required navigating around a chest and a chair to get to it. He moved it to sit closer to the door, cleared the path of anything that could catch a crutch tip, and put a solid chair, not decorative, functional at the bedside where it could serve as a rest point or a brace, depending on what was needed. He didn't do any of this dramatically. He didn't tell Cass it was a grand gesture. He didn't think about it in those terms. He thought about it the way he thought about preparing a stall for a horse with a particular need. You looked at what the animal required to move comfortably and safely through its space, and you modified the space accordingly. The animal's dignity and independence depended on you getting the practical details right. The gesture was in the details. When Hetty came through the front door on the day of the move, she came up the new ramp on her crutches and into the main room, and stopped. She stood still for a moment. Her eyes moved across the room with her characteristic precision. The handrail along the hall wall, the lowered counter visible through the kitchen doorway, the cleared path to the bedroom. She was reading the space the way she read a document, taking in its full content before responding to any part of it. Cass had come inside behind her and was making himself useful with the supply boxes near the door. Hetty looked at the kitchen counter. Then she turned and looked at the handrail. Then she looked at F, who was standing near the window with his arms at his sides and no particular expression on his face. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You lowered the counter 4 inches." She looked at the kitchen again. "And the handrails are mounted at." She moved to the hallway and put her hand on one, testing the height. "Yes, that's right." She ran her hand along it toward the bedroom door. He watched her follow the rail down the hallway and into the bedroom, and he heard her stop up there. He waited. She came back out. After a minute, she stood in the hallway doorway and looked at him across the main room. "You didn't do things for me," she said. "No, you changed the space so I could do things myself. That's what needed doing." She held his gaze for a long time. He didn't look away, and he didn't elaborate, because he'd said what was accurate, and anything added would be less accurate. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. When did you do this?" 4 days while the court was finishing up. "You rode out here every day for 4 days. The horses needed tending," he said. She looked at him. "And the counter needed lowering," he said. Something moved across her face. Not quickly, not with any drama, just a slow change like a landscape shifting when the cloud cover breaks. She turned and looked down the hallway, at the ramp visible at the back door. "The ramps," she said. "Both doors?" She was quiet again. He could see her working through something, not the practical content of the modifications, which she'd already assessed and cataloged with characteristic speed, something underneath that. So no one has ever. She started and stopped. "I've had people help me. Since the surgery, Sarah and Morrison, And Cass. She paused. But helping someone and changing the conditions so they don't need help are fundamentally different things. She looked at him. Most people don't think about the second one. Most people think help is the end of it, he said. It isn't. No, she said. It isn't. He crossed the room and stopped a few feet from where she was standing. Are you hungry? There's venison in the cold store. I can have something on in 20 minutes. She looked at him, and then she laughed brief and real, slightly surprised by itself, the way genuine laughter is. Yes, she said. I'm very hungry, and I want to help cook. The counter's the right height now, he said. I noticed. The first week settled into a pattern that felt, to F's quiet surprise, entirely natural. He was up before dawn to work the horses. Hetty was up shortly after, moving through the modified kitchen on her crutches with increasing confidence and a running internal commentary on the ranch's bookkeeping system that she'd begun extracting from the boxes. F had kept records in with varying degrees of consistency. These ledgers, she said, on the third morning, holding up a water-damaged notebook from 1,884 with an expression of professional concern. I know, he said. This is 4 years of breeding records and expense accounts in one volume, in pencil, without index tabs. I know. And this one, she held up a second notebook, appears to be the same time period, but organized differently, which means you were keeping parallel records that don't cross-reference. I started the second one because I couldn't find the first one. She looked at him. And where was the first one? In the box you're holding. She set both notebooks on the counter, the lowered counter, at exactly the right height, and opened them side by side. I'm going to reconstruct a proper ledger system, she said, going back to 1,882, which appears to be when you started the ranch. I'll need all the boxes. All right. It will take time. We have time, he said. She looked at him with an expression that held something complicated in it, and then turned back to the ledgers. Yes, she said. We do. She worked at the kitchen table in the mornings, the account books spread around her, a fresh ledger she'd sent to town for, through Cass open in the center. Her handwriting was precise and even, and she moved through the numbers with genuine absorption, catching patterns, flagging discrepancies, building a picture of the ranch's financial history that F had never actually had. He came in at noon one day to find her 3 hours into what appeared to be a complete reanalysis of the past year's breeding costs versus returns. You're more profitable than you know, she said, without looking up. He poured coffee. How much more? The Harrington sale in September was underpriced by approximately 20% based on comparable sales I found in the regional livestock reports. She made a note. The Morrison's horse, the gray, gelding you sold them, in October, you charged $40. That was fair price. The equivalent animal sold in Laramie 3 weeks later for $62. She looked up. You're good at raising horses, F. You're somewhat less good at knowing what they're worth. He sat down, across from her. Is that a problem? It's something I can address, she said. It was not modest, and it was not arrogant. It was simply accurate. He looked at her across the table. The notebooks spread around her, her pen moving. The morning light through the window, making the room warmer than the temperature warranted. She was in her element. He could see it. The same absorption she'd had when she wrote about bookbinding in those early letters. That particular focus that meant a person was doing the thing they were built for. Hetty, he said. She looked up. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. I generally answer things honestly, I know. He looked at the table between them. Is this what you wanted? When you answered the advertisement? When you decided to come out here? He looked up. This, the ledgers and the ranch, and all of it. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the books around her, and then at the window, and then at him. I wanted to be somewhere I was useful, she said, where what I contributed mattered and wasn't managed or diminished, where I could do real work. She looked at the kitchen counter, the handrail, the ramp visible at the back door, and where the space I lived in treated me like someone who deserved to be in it. He waited. Yes, she said. This is what I wanted. A pause. It's more than I expected. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. Good, he said. Cass came out twice a week for the smithing work the ranch required, and also, F suspected, because he'd become genuinely interested in Hetty's reading and writing sessions. It had started in the second week. 3 children from neighboring properties had begun showing up at the broken spear tube belonging to the Kendrick Ranch to the south, and one whose mother was the Garnet Falls seamstress who lived a mile up the creek road. They came initially because their parents had heard something about Hetty and were curious. And they kept coming because Hetty was the most interesting teacher they'd encountered. She taught the way she did everything directly, without condescension, with high expectations and genuine investment in whether understanding was actually occurring. She didn't simplify language to the point of uselessness. She gave the children real books, real texts, and talked about them, as though the children's opinions were worth hearing, which produced the reliable effect of making children feel that their opinions were worth forming. Cass had arrived one afternoon in the middle of a session about the geography of Wyoming Territory and had stood in the kitchen doorway for 20 minutes before admitting he'd heard the last part and had a question. Hetty had answered his question. Then she'd asked him one back. The following week he came on session day on purpose. She didn't make anything of it. She simply made room at the table, the same as she did for the children, and they worked through a passage from a history of the American West that she'd had Cass bring from the general store's small book stock. Cass read slowly and carefully, his right finger tracking under the words, his face concentrated. The children glanced at him occasionally with the curiosity children brought to adult behavior. They didn't have full context for. F watched from the doorway one evening after the session had ended and the children had gone home, and Cass was sitting at the kitchen table, with the book still open, reading ahead on his own. Cass looked up and saw F watching, and didn't pretend he hadn't been caught. She explains things in a way that makes them stick, he said. I know, F said. She doesn't talk down, no, she doesn't. Cass looked at the book. I went to school until I was 12. After the arm, there wasn't. He stopped. There were things I thought were past the point of addressing. F said nothing. He leaned against the doorframe and let the silence be what it was. She said something to me last week, Cass said. I told her I was slow with reading, and she told me that slow and incapable were not the same thing, and that most reading difficulties in adults were the product of poor teaching rather than poor learners. He paused. She said it the same way she says everything, like it was just information. Obvious information. She has a way of making things obvious, F said. Yes. Cass closed the book. You're going to marry her. F was quiet. That's not a question, Cass said. I know it isn't. Cass stood up and put the book in his coat pocket with the particular care of someone who has recently acquired something he intends to keep. Have you talked to her about it? Not yet. Are you planning to? When it's the right time. Cass put his hat on. F, you rode into a blizzard for her. You rebuilt your house for her. She dismantled a criminal conspiracy from a clinic table for you. He looked at him. The time has been right for a while. He went out, and the door closed behind him, and Eve stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the table where the books were stacked, and the lamp was still burning, and the room felt inhabited in a way it hadn't for years. He asked her on a Thursday evening in the third week, not with elaborate staging. He'd thought about how to do it, and come back to the same conclusion every time, which was that Hetty would respond better to honesty than to theater, and that an honest question deserved an honest answer delivered without the pressure of excessive ceremony. They were on the porch after supper. It was cold, but not brutally cold. The temperature had moderated slightly as March moved through its middle weeks, and the sky was the particular ink, dark of a clear Wyoming night, with stars that looked close enough to be recent. He'd brought 2 cups of coffee. She was on the bench he'd built along the porch wall, a blanket across her lap, looking out at the meadow where the snow was beginning to show the first pale suggestion of thaw along the south-facing edges. He sat beside her and gave her the coffee and looked at the meadow for a while. Then he said, I want to marry you. She turned her head and looked at him. I'm telling you that clearly, because you've told me several times that you don't want things managed or prettied up into something they aren't. He held his coffee cup and looked at her. And because you deserve a direct question rather than a performance. He paused. Will you marry me, Hetty? She looked at him for a long moment, The kind of look she gave things she was taking seriously. Not hesitation. Something more deliberate than hesitation. I came out here to be a partner, she said finally. Not a kept woman. Not a decoration. A partner. I know. And everything since I arrived. She stopped. The counter. The rails. The ramps. The way you ask before you help. The way you listened in the cabin and didn't dismiss what I said. She looked at the meadow. You've treated me the way my father said. A person ought to be treated, which I stopped expecting from anyone who wasn't him. F waited. Yes, she said. She looked at him. Yes, I'll marry you. He looked at her in the dark. Then he said, good. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhale. Good, she repeated. That's what you say. I could say more. No, she said. Good is right. It's accurate. She looked at the meadow again. Good covers it. He reached over and took her hand the way he'd taken it in the cabin. Not romantically, not with performance, just covering her hand with his and leaving it there. Her fingers were warmer now than they'd been that first night. She turned her hand and laced her fingers through his, and they sat like that on the porch in the cold dark with their coffee going cold and the stars doing their remote, indifferent work overhead. The spring, she said. What about it? Can we do it in the spring? When the valley looks the way you described it. Yes, he said. That's a good time. I want the children there. Cast the Morrisons. She paused. I want it to look like what it actually is. What is it? She was quiet for a moment. Something real, she said. Something that started in letters and survived a blizzard and a jailhouse and a courtroom and is still standing. She looked at him. That deserves to look like what it is. Then that's what it will look like, he said. The meadow lay white and quiet in the dark below them, and Shoshone Creek moved somewhere in the middle distance with its particular cold sound, running free through the valley the way it was supposed to run. The horses were settled in the barn. The lamp was still on in the kitchen window, throwing a yellow rectangle across the porch floor. Hetty Vance sat on the porch of the Broken Spear with her hand in F's and looked at the country that was beginning, incrementally and at its own pace, to become hers. Spring was still weeks away. There was still work to do. The ledgers, the sessions at the kitchen table, the slow business of a body rebuilding itself, the slower business of two people learning the specific daily grammar of each other's company. There would be hard days in all of it. But the creek was running, and the stars were out, and somewhere under the snow the ground was keeping its patient appointment with warmth. It would come. The first sign was the smell. F caught it before he saw anything pine resin burning wrong too fast, with the particular chemical bite of something accelerated. He was 50 yards from the barn when the orange light appeared at the edge of the haymow window, and he was running before he'd consciously made the decision to run. It was 2 in the morning. The valley was dead quiet except for the wind coming down off the mountain, and the fire ate that quiet in about 30 seconds. He got the barn doors open and got 4 horses out before the smoke drove him back. The bay mare came last, because of course she did, and he had to go back in for her with his coat over his face and his eyes burning, and she came out snorting and wild-eyed and bit him on the shoulder in the process, which under any other circumstances would have been her typical editorial on unexpected handling. He got her tied to the fence post and turned around and saw 2 men coming out of the tree line to the north with lanterns and rifles, and the specific purposeful stride of people who'd been sent to finish a job. He went for the Winchester. The first shot went into the snow at his feet, which meant warning, which meant they wanted him pinned down rather than dead, which meant there was a third man somewhere behind him, probably heading for the house. He rolled behind the water trough and put 2 rounds in the direction of the tree line and heard one of them swear and go down behind a fence post. The other dropped his lantern and fell back into the dark, and F tracked the sound of his boots in the snow for as long as he could before it disappeared. Third man, the house. He couldn't get there. The angle was wrong. The open ground between the barn and the house was lit up now from the fire, and the man in the tree line had him positioned. Every time F moved north, the pine post took a shot, keeping him honest. He thought about Hetty. He thought about her in the bed, in the modified room, with the solid chair at the bedside and the handrail along the wall. And he thought about the chest of affidavits and petitions and witnessed documents that lived on the shelf above Morrison's medical instructions, and he thought about what Drake's man was there to do. He started moving anyway. Inside the house, Hetty was already awake. She'd been awake since the smell reached the bedroom window, which she'd cracked open an inch against the stuffiness of the sealed winter room. Fire. She knew what fire smelled like, and she knew what this particular fire meant, and she lay still for exactly the length of time it took her to assess the situation and make her decisions. Then she got up. The crutches were at the bedside where they always were. She was on them and moving before the first rifle shot cracked outside, and she went to the window first, not the door, because she needed to know what she was working with. She could see the barn burning. She could see F behind the water trough. She could see the muzzle flash from the tree line, which told her where the immediate threat was positioned. She also saw the shadow moving around the north corner of the house. She didn't panic. Panic was a waste of time she didn't have, so she put it aside and went to the shelf. Cass had brought the shotgun out 2 weeks ago on the unspoken logic of men who understood threat assessment. A double-barreled 10-gauge, short-stocked, which Hetty had never fired, but had asked Cass to show her how to load, and which she'd practiced loading 6 times in the week since he'd brought it. He'd watched her do it the first time with an expression of careful neutrality, and the second time with something closer to satisfaction, and then he'd said nothing more about it because there wasn't anything more to say. She had it loaded before the shadow reached the back door. The back door opened inward over the ramp, and the man who came through it was carrying a lantern in one hand and a can of kerosene in the other, and he had 3 seconds of complete confusion when he found the room lit by the lamp. Hetty had already turned up, and Hetty, standing in the kitchen doorway on her crutches with the shotgun leveled at the center of his chest. "Put it down," she said. He looked at her. He looked at the gun. He looked at the kerosene can in his own hand, which under the current geometry was a spectacularly bad thing to be holding. He put it down. "The lantern," she said. He set it on the floor. "Sit down against that wall and put your hands on your head." He did. She kept the shotgun on him and raised her voice. F. Outside, something had changed in the exchange by the fence line. The rifle had gone quiet. She heard boots on the porch, and then F came through the front door fast. Winchester first, and she watched him take in the room in about 1 second. The man against the wall, the kerosene can on the floor, Hetty on her crutches with the shotgun, and she watched the specific quality of his expression shift from something wound tight and dangerous to something different. He crossed to her and put his hand on the barrel of the shotgun gently, and she let him take it.
"Are you hurt?" he said.
No. She looked at the man against the wall. He didn't get far enough to do anything. F looked at the kerosene can. Then he looked at the man on the floor, who was doing his best to appear smaller than he was. "The other two," she said. "One's down in the snow, shoulder." The other ran. He checked the shotgun in his hands, noted it was loaded properly, with both hammers ready. He looked at her. "You loaded this yourself." "I did. In the dark, I turned the lamp up. First," she said. "I'm not reckless." He stood there for a moment with the shotgun in his hands and looked at her. Outside, the barn was still burning, the sound of it a deep, consuming roar that was slowly turning into the lower sound of something spent. The horses were safe. He'd gotten them all out. "The documents?" she said. "In the chest?" "Untouched." She nodded toward the shelf. He didn't reach them. F looked at the shelf. He looked at the chest of papers. He looked at the man on the floor, and then at Hetty, and then at the kerosene can sitting harmless on the plank floor. "I need to get water on the barn," he said. "Go," she said. "I have him." He went. She stood in the kitchen with the shotgun and the man against the wall, and outside the barn burned itself down to its bones in the winter dark, and the horses stood at the fence line making their opinions audible. And F worked the water chain until his arms gave out, and the structure was down to stone and wet char. When he came back inside an hour later, he was black with smoke, and his shoulder ached where the bay mare had gotten him, and his hands were blistered from the bucket handles. He looked like a man who'd been through something serious. Hetty was sitting at the kitchen table. The man was still against the wall, tied now with the leather straps from Hetty's craft bag, which were considerably more effective binding material than most people realized. She had the shotgun across her lap and a cup of cold coffee in her hand and the ledger open on the table, because apparently she had been doing ranch accounting while guarding a captive arsonist, which F found he could not fully process, so he set it aside. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She got up, set the shotgun on the table where she could reach it, and made him fresh coffee and looked at his hands. She dressed the blisters with the same supplies Morrison had left, working methodically, without ceremony. "Drake's out of time," she said. Her voice was quiet. "This is what men do when they're out of time. They burn things, I know, which means we're close to the end of it." She tied off the last bandage. "The marshals are 2 days out. If your letter got through." "It got through." Cass confirmed it. She looked at the man against the wall. "He'll tell Drake what happened here. Or someone will." She looked back at F. "Drake will run, or he'll make one more move." "He'll make one more move," F said. "He's not the running kind." She looked at him steadily. "Then we need to be ready for whichever direction it comes from." "Yes." She sat back down and pulled the ledger toward her. She made a note in it, which was not a note about ranch accounts, but a written record of the night's events time, names, the kerosene can, the specific nature of the attack dated and signed in her precise hand, because that was Hetty. She turned everything into evidence. F drank his coffee and watched the man against the wall and let her work. Outside, the valley was very still. The barn was ash and stone. The horses were unsettled at the fence. The stars were enormous and cold overhead, the way Wyoming stars got when the air was cleanest and the cold was most absolute. But the house was standing. The documents were intact. And in 2 days, the marshals were coming. That was enough. The marshals arrived on a Thursday morning with the light. There were 4 of them. Federal men out of Cheyenne, led by a tall woman named Deputy Marshal Clara Estes, who had been working the Wyoming Territory for 8 years and had the particular quality of stillness that long experience in dangerous situations produces. She arrived at the Broken Spear first, before going into town, which was deliberate. If met her in the yard, what was left of the barn was behind him, black ribs against the white sky. Estes looked at it. The letter said arson 2 nights ago. "We have one of them in the county holding cell. Aldous put him there after I brought him in." She looked at Eve. "Aldous. He's been cooperative since the circuit court session," F said. "He testified against Drake in January. He's been straight since." She wrote something in her notebook. "I'll want the man from the barn. He'll talk. He talked to us." Estes looked at the house. Then she looked at F with the direct, assessing attention of someone who had learned to read situations from their surfaces. "The woman, Vance. She's here?" "Inside. She's the one who filed the original petition and the affidavits." "Yes. I've read her documentation," Estes said. She closed the notebook. "It's the clearest evidentiary package I've seen from a civilian witness in this territory in 6 years." She paused. "Tell her I said so." They rode into Garnet Falls at mid-morning. Estes and her 3 deputies alongside EF on the bay mare. The street went still the way it always did when something was happening. That particular small town quiet of people stopping what they were doing and staying stopped. Phineas Drake came out of the hotel when he heard the horses. He was dressed well, as always the watch chain, the good coat, and he had 2 men behind him, which was 2 fewer than he'd had in January. Most of his operation had quietly relocated, or quietly distanced itself. Over the past 6 weeks, the way structures built on bad foundations quietly shifted when the ground changed. Estes pulled up 20 feet from the hotel steps. "Phineas Drake," she said. Her voice carried without effort. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges including criminal conspiracy, murder, arson, fraud, and illegal interference with territorial water rights. You can come with me now, or I can have this conversation in a way neither of us will enjoy." Drake looked at Estes. He looked at the 4 deputies. He looked at F. His expression went through several changes in about 5 seconds calculation, assessment, the brief and visible moment when a man measures his options and finds them smaller than he expected. He looked at his 2 men. One of them stepped back. Just 1 step, just slightly, but Drake saw it, and F saw Drake see it. "I want my lawyer," Drake said. You'll have him, Estes said. Come on. He came off the steps without any more theater, and Estes put the cuffs on him herself, and the two men who'd been standing behind him dispersed into the street so quickly it was like they'd never been there. The street watched, all of it. The women from the general store, the men from the saloon, the hotel proprietor, the families who'd come in from the valley properties for the weekly supply run. They stood on the boardwalks and watched Phineas Drake, who had spent 2 years buying and intimidating and burning and sawing and renting their fear by the hour, walk down the main street of Garnet Falls in federal handcuffs. Nobody cheered. This wasn't a story that felt like cheering. It felt like a weightlifting which was quieter than cheering but more real. Cass was on the boardwalk outside the smithy. He watched Drake go past with an expression that was careful and still, and then he looked at F, and F looked back at him, and something passed between them that didn't need words. The trial was in Cheyenne in the spring. F and Hetty both testified. Estes presented the physical evidence, the sawed axle section, the harness cuts, the documented chain of the sealed complaint from the homesteaders, the affidavits, the arson witness. Hetty's technical description of the cut marks on the axle and the harness leather was entered into the record and was, as the territory's appointed examiner confirmed, accurate in every particular. Drake was convicted on all primary counts. The corrupt marshal was convicted separately and served 2 years before being released, which was not enough, and was also the law working the way the law worked, imperfectly and within its limits. The water rights suspension on Shoshone Creek became permanent. Consolidated Valley Holdings was dissolved. The homesteaders downstream got their usage restored with a formal territorial guarantee. Purvis's daughter came up from Laramie in April. Her name was Margaret, and she was 19, and she sat in the back of the courtroom during the sentencing, and she didn't cry. Afterward, she introduced herself to Hetty in the courthouse hallway, quietly, and they spoke for a few minutes that F stayed well away from, understanding that this was not a conversation he was part of. When Hetty came back to where he was waiting, she was carrying something Margaret had given her, a small photograph, faded, of Purvis in his stage driver's coat, standing in front of a coach. She put it carefully in her bag. She didn't say anything about the conversation. F didn't ask. Some things didn't need reporting. They needed carrying, and Hetty knew how to carry things. They rode back to Garnet Falls through the beginning of spring, the valley greening slowly along the creek edges, the snow retreating up the mountain faces. The air had lost the killing quality that winter air had out here. It was still cold, but it was the kind of cold that had an end in sight. Aldous met them at the edge of town on their return. He'd submitted his resignation to the territorial government 2 weeks after the circuit court session in January, and the town had elected a new marshal in February, a steady man from the valley named Gerald Hatch, who had no particular ties to anyone's interests except the law's. Aldous was still in Garnet Falls, working at the feed store, which was a comma down from being a marshal, and was probably the appropriate one. He stopped F on the road. He looked uncomfortable, which was a condition he'd become familiar with, and was learning to occupy without collapsing. "I want to say something," Aldous said. F waited. "I know sorry doesn't fix a week in a jail cell. I know it doesn't fix what happened to Miss Vance." He looked at his hands. "I know I can't fix those things, but I want you to know that I understand why what I did was wrong, and not just because it came out badly. It was wrong before it came out badly." He stopped. "That's what I wanted to say." F looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said. He moved the bay mare forward, and then stopped. "Aldous." He looked back. "You told Hartwell that mattered." Aldous nodded once. F rode on back at the ranch. Hetty was quiet through the evening. Not sad quiet. The other kind. The kind that was processing something that needed space to settle before it could be named. She sat on the porch at dusk, with the blanket across her lap, and looked at the valley, which was doing its slow spring business of becoming itself again. F sat beside her and didn't say anything for a while. "It's over," she said finally. "It's over. It doesn't feel the way I expected it to feel." "It never does," he said. "You build up to a thing for months, and then it resolves, And the thing that's left is just the ordinary world, which has been there all along. She thought about that. The ordinary world is what we were fighting for, she said. People living their lives without someone's thumb on their neck, creek water running where it's supposed to run. She looked at the creek. That should feel larger than it does. It'll feel larger in a week, he said. When you wake up and the problem isn't there, and you realize it's gone. She looked at him. How do you know that? Because I've had other things end, he said quietly. The war, the army. He looked at the mountain line. Clara. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on his arm, briefly, and then took it back, which was enough. The stars came out over the valley. The creek talked to itself in the dark. Somewhere in the temporary structure Cass had built where the barn had been, the horses shifted and settled and were quiet. Spring, she said. Yes, he said. Spring. The wedding happened on the first Saturday in May, which arrived that year, with the particular extravagance of Wyoming springs. Everything green at once, the creek running full and cold with snowmelt, the meadow so bright it almost hurt to look at it direct. Hetty had said she wanted it to look like what it was, so that's what it looked like. No theater, no borrowed ceremony, just the broken spear on the best morning it had shown anyone in a long time, with the people who'd earned the right to be there standing in the meadow grass while Judge Hartwell, who'd made a detour on his spring circuit specifically for the occasion, said the words that needed saying. Cass stood at F's left and cried, which he denied afterward, with a conviction that no one challenged to his face. Sarah Morrison cried openly and was proud of it. Morrison himself maintained his professional composure right up until Hetty came across the meadow, on her crutches in a dress the color of creek water. And then he quietly borrowed his wife's handkerchief and said nothing about it. The 3 children from the kitchen table lessons were there with their families, clean scrubbed and serious about their responsibilities as witnesses. The youngest, the seamstress's boy, had written out a poem for the occasion that he delivered from memory in a voice that only cracked once, which was a significant achievement for a 10-year-old in front of an audience. Margaret Purvis had come up from Laramie. She stood at the edge of the gathering, with her hands folded and watched, and when Hetty caught her eye across the meadow and nodded, Margaret nodded back, and that was the whole of it, which was the right amount. The vows were Eve's own language. He'd written them out at the kitchen table 3 nights before, crossed out most of it, and started over. What he had when he got to the meadow was less than he'd planned and more honest, which Hetty would have told him was the better outcome if he'd asked her. But he hadn't asked her because it was a surprise, and she was someone who appreciated genuine surprises, which were different from ambushes. He said, I'm not offering you a comfortable life. I'm offering you a real one. I'm offering you this land and this work and a house that was built with you in mind and a partnership that I intend to earn every day. He looked at her. You showed me what a real partner was. I'm still learning. I'll keep learning, she said. I came here to be useful on my own terms. You made that possible. You made space for me without making it smaller. She paused. I will work beside you for as long as you'll have me, and I will tell you honestly when you're wrong. And I expect the same. Hartwell said, That'll do it, with a dryness that produced laughter, which relaxed the moment into something warm and immediate. F put the ring on her finger plain silver, made by Cass, which was the only appropriate choice, and she put one on his, which he hadn't expected, and when he looked at her, she had the small, controlled smile she used when she'd managed a surprise successfully. I had Cass make 2, she said. I see that, he said. 2 partners, she said. 2 rings. He had nothing to add to that. He kissed her, and the gathered company made the sounds that gathered companies make, and the meadow was very green around all of them, and the creek ran cold and clear behind the house where the water rights were restored and permanent. After, when the food had been eaten and the coffee drunk, and the children had run themselves into exhausted contentment in the meadow grass, F brought out the box. It was cedar, plain, with a brass latch. He'd kept it in the barn for 2 weeks, and moved it to the tack room when the barn burned, and moved it again to the cold store when the rebuilding started, treating it with a care that Cass had noticed and not commented on. He set it in front of Hetty on the porch table. She looked at it, then she looked at him, then she opened it. Inside, wrapped in wool felt, were a pair of boots. They were beautiful work. The leather was dark chestnut, oiled to a depth that meant it had been done right and then done again, the stitching even and tight, the way expert stitching was. The left boot was standard in its construction shaped for a foot and a stride, built to last and to flex in the right places. The right boot was different. Where a standard boot had a heel of ordinary height, this one had a heel that was weighted and padded and elevated built up, with a precision that accounted for the specific change in her gait since the surgery, the slight imbalance that even the best crutch work couldn't fully address when she wanted to walk without them. It was fitted not to a generic foot, but to hers, measured from the cast that the cobbler in Cheyenne had made from the plaster mold F had sent him, which was why he'd spent an afternoon at Morrison's with plaster and a pot and Hetty's patient but puzzled cooperation 3 months ago. She picked up the right boot and looked at it. She turned it over. She ran her thumb along the heel, feeling the layers, the wood and the leather and the padding and the wedge of the correction. All of it fitted together with the precision of someone who understood the mechanics of what he was making. She put it down. She looked at the meadow for a moment, looked at the creek, looked at the children who had collapsed in the grass with the particular boneless relaxation of children who have played hard and are not yet ready to admit it. "You sent them measurements," she said. "Yes, 3 months ago, February. They needed time to get it right." She looked at the boots. "You knew in February. I knew before February," he said. "But February was when I had the right measurements." She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and steady, and doing something complicated that she was not going to make simpler for him. "Try them," he said. She tried them. She laced them on. The ordinary one first, then the right, working slowly and with care. And then she stood up, without the crutches. She hadn't stood without the crutches for any real distance in 3 months. And Morrison had said perhaps by summer, which was the kind of perhaps that was really a probably, not that he didn't want to say directly. She stood. She took 1 step, then another. Then she was walking across the porch, not fast, not without effort, but walking with both feet meeting the ground, with something much closer to evenness than anything she'd managed since January. The weighted heel did what it was built to do. It gave the changed foot a platform that worked with her body's adjustment rather than against it. She walked to the porch railing and back. Then she did it again. Then she stopped and stood still with her hands at her sides and her chin up and looked at F. "They're not conventional," he said. "No," she said. "They're better than conventional." He looked at her. "Cass can adjust the heel as your gait settles. The cobbler built in some room for it. I know. I can see how it's constructed." She looked down at the boots. "How long did you spend figuring out the specifications?" "A while." "How long is a while?" "Long enough to write 6 letters to the cobbler and get 4 back." She looked up at him. He was standing by the porch post with his arms at his sides and no particular expression, which was communicating something that he didn't have words for and had decided to communicate through 6 letters to a cobbler in Cheyenne instead. She crossed the porch to him. She stood in front of him in the boots that were not conventional but were exactly right, and she looked at him with the full, direct attention she gave to things she was taking seriously. "F," she said. "Yes, these are the most useful and the most thoughtful gift I have ever been given." "Good," he said. "And then, because they were themselves and not anyone else, I figured you'd prefer useful to sentimental." "I prefer both," she said, "when they're the same thing." He almost smiled. "Both, then." She turned and walked to the porch edge and looked out at the meadow where the children were stirring again, pulling themselves upright from the grass with the slow reluctance of people not ready for the day to finish. Cass was sitting with Morrison near the creek, the 2 of them in chairs that had been carried out for the occasion, talking about something with the relaxed quality of men who'd run out of things to worry about for one afternoon. Sarah was picking wildflowers with Margaret near the fence line. The flowers were small and yellow, and the kind that arrived first in Wyoming spring, still tentative, still close to the ground, but definitively present. The creek moved past them all, free and cold and unbothered. Hetty rested her hand on the porch rail and looked at her valley. That was how she thought of it now, hers, and F's and the community's, all three being true at once, which was how it worked when things were working right. F came to stand beside her. They stood together on the porch of the broken spear without saying anything for a while, watching the valley do its patient spring business of becoming what it had been before the winter, and more than it had been before. The way things that survive hard seasons usually came back. Then Hetty said, "You rode into a killing blizzard to save my life, F." He was quiet for a moment. The creek talked. A horse made a sound in the rebuilt barn behind them. One of the children called something to another across the meadow. He laced his fingers through hers. "No, Hetty," he said. "The blizzard just brought you to my door. Your own fierce spirit saved your life and taught me what a real partner truly is." She looked at him sideways. That was almost poetic. "Don't tell Cass. He'll find out eventually." "I know," F said. "I'm hoping to be far away when he does." She laughed full and real, and slightly surprised by itself, the way her laughter always was. It carried out across the meadow, and the children looked up, and Sarah Morrison looked up, and Cass turned from his conversation with Morrison to see what had happened, and when he saw Hetty laughing on the porch with F's hand in hers, he turned back without making anything of it, which was the whole of what the moment needed. The sun moved across the valley in the slow way May suns moved over that country, generous with itself, in no hurry to finish. Under the porch, in the shadow of the boards, the first green shoots of the season had found their way up through the cold Wyoming groundsmall, persistent, entirely unimpressive to look at, and entirely impossible to stop, which was, Hetty had decided, the most accurate metaphor for most things worth believing in. She held her husband's hand and watched the afternoon go long and golden over the broken spear, and the Ledgers were inside waiting, and the children would want their next lesson on Monday, and Cass needed to look at the right boot's heel adjustment in a week, and there was a letter to write to Margaret in Laramie, and the horses needed the east pasture fence repaired before summer. There was so much to do. She was looking forward to all of it. And there's a moment near the end of this story that I keep coming back to. EF stands at the jailhouse window, locked up on a charge he didn't commit, watching a woman on crutches stop in the middle of a frozen Wyoming street and speak to an entire town that had already written her off. He can't hear the words through the log wall. He doesn't need to. He can read the stillness she produces in people, the way a stone produces stillness in water when you drop it in. And I think that moment is the whole heart of this story. Because this isn't really a Western about a blizzard, or a sabotaged stagecoach, or a villain with water rights and a bone saw. Those things are the weather the story moves through. What the story is actually about is something quieter and harder to name, the question of what we owe each other when things get genuinely difficult. Not when the sun is shining, when the storm rolls in. F says it plainly, out loud, when Cass tries to talk him out of riding into the blizzard. Trust isn't something you give when the sun is shining and take back the moment a storm rolls in. He says it like it's obvious, like it's just the way things are. But look around at the world we actually live in, and you'll notice pretty quickly that it isn't obvious at all. Most people's commitment runs exactly as far as their comfort does. The moment things get costly, the moment keeping your word requires something real, that's when you find out what the word was actually worth. Eve rides out anyway, in a killing blizzard, on a horse with hooves the size of supper plates, into country that has a place called Dead Man's Pass that earned its name in weather exactly like this. He rides because he wrote it in a letter she has in her pocket, wherever she is. "I will meet you at that depot." That's the whole of his reasoning. He said it. She's counting on it. That's enough. And here's what the story asks us to sit with. What does it mean to be that kind of person? Not the heroic kind. F is not a man who thinks of himself in heroic terms. He's practical. He packs extra blankets and sealed matches and a medical kit. He trusts his horse. He doesn't ride into the blizzard because it's dramatic. He rides into it because the alternative, sitting by the fire while his word freezes somewhere out on the mountain, is simply not something he's able to do. That's the first thing this story is about. The difference between a promise and a performance. Most of what passes for commitment in the world is actually performance, the words said in good conditions, when keeping them costs nothing. A real promise is the kind F makes, the kind that gets heavier when the weather turns bad, not lighter. The kind that means something precisely because you keep it when it's hard. But Hetty is the other half of this. She came out to Wyoming because she was tired of shrinking. That's the quiet engine underneath her whole story. She was a good teacher who was told her personal life needed to be appropriate. She was a woman of sharp, independent mind in a world that kept offering her cages decorated to look like opportunities. She answered that advertisement, not because she was desperate, but because she was looking for something specific, a space where what she contributed would be valued without requiring her to become smaller to fit. What this story leaves you with, if you let it, is a particular question, not a comfortable one. When your own storm rolls in, and it will, they always do, what kind of person do you want to be? The kind who stayed warm by the fire and told themselves the conditions weren't right? Or the kind who checked their saddlebags, trusted their horse, and rode out anyway? The creek is running. Spring is coming. There's work to do. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations are entirely invented for narrative purposes and do not represent real historical persons or incidents.